From the beginning, he faced an uphill struggle with an often violent father who drank heavily. It was a tough, punishing childhood that mirrored the Rio Grande Valley's forbidding terrain. His paternal grandfather, Ethan Ray, not his real name, had come to the Abo Pass in the 1920s, homesteading a few acres of arid land outside Mountainair, 30 miles west of Belen. Like many other impoverished ranchers, he had been drawn to this inhospitable valley by the Early-Day Homestead Act of 1889, which had attracted pioneering spirits to large areas of central New Mexico. In 1891, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, linking Kansas City to Santa Fe, announced plans to build a cutoff to Belen through the Abo Pass, thereby guaranteeing a new prosperity to the town. On hearing about these new opportunities out west, adventurous Kansas City newspaperman John Corbett and his friend Colonel E.C. Manning bought a prime site beside the projected railroad route at the summit of the 6,500-foot pass. Local legend has it that they were so enchanted by the summer breeze wafting off the overhead mountains, they named it Mountainair. In the summer of 1903, Mountainair was officially incorporated into a town, 9 years before New Mexico was granted statehood. Construction of the Belen cutoff to Mountainair was temporarily delayed by the first Wall Street crash of 1903, but 4 years later the economy improved, and the first passenger trains finally started rolling through the Abo Pass. In its early days, Mountainair did not have an adequate water supply for its growing population, so the first settlers hauled barrels of water 8 miles into town from Barranca Canyon wells, before wells were finally dug 300 feet deep into the foothills outside town. By the time former miner and geologist Ethan Ray claimed his patch of land, 20 miles outside Mountainair in Socorro County, the town was flourishing, proudly proclaiming itself the pinto bean capital of the world. Ethan and his 2 sons, Cecil and Alton, built the ranch with their bare hands, eking out a living raising cows. But the Rays kept mainly to themselves, having little to do with their neighbors, the nearest living 10 miles away. The Rays lived deep in the rural backwoods, 4 miles away from the nearest highway between Brook Spring and Dripping Stream, and once a week they drove the 25 miles into Mountainair in their ramshackle old truck to pick up essential supplies. Opportunities were few for young men growing up in New Mexico during the Great Depression, and the 2 younger Rays left home at the earliest opportunity to make their ways in the outside world. Alton Ray was a wheeler-dealer who lived on his wits, buying and selling goods he picked up on his frequent visits to Alaska. He would leave his wife Mildred for months at a time on secret trading expeditions, arriving back in Mountainair flushed with money and gifts for everyone. In the mid-1930s, his brother Cecil left home and followed the Abo Pass Trail to Belen, where he married a local girl named Nettie Opal Parker. Having little money or prospects, Cecil moved into Nettie's parents' tiny ranch, deep in the hills south of Skull, west of Mountainair. In late 1939, Nettie bore Cecil a son they named David, followed a year later by daughter Peggy. But Cecil, a heavy drinker, had a restless spirit and would vent his frustrations on his wife and 2 young children. His dad had a temper, remembered Audie Miranda, who was David's best friend growing up. I heard some things about his dad, but I don't want to repeat them. When he had been drinking, Cecil Ray could be violent at the least provocation. Eventually, when David was 10 years old, his father walked out, moving to Albuquerque and divorcing Nettie. It was a traumatic time for the Ray children, who rarely saw their father again until they were grown up. And when Nettie Parker decided to remain with her parents, David and Peggy were shipped off to Mountainair to be raised by their grandparents. Known to everyone as Old Man Parker, Ethan Ray, then in his late 60s, was a strict disciplinarian who insisted on the highest standards of dress and behavior. The kids were expected to do ranch work before they left for school in the morning and when they returned at night. But although money was short, their grandmother always made certain the children were clean and neatly turned out in their hand-me-downs. "We were raised real old-fashioned," Peggy would remember many years later. "You don't even think about lying about things." Every morning their grandfather would drive David and his pretty red-haired sister 4 miles to the main road in his battered old Chevy coupe. Then he would leave them to wait for the 7:30 a.m. school bus to take them 20 miles to Mountainair High School. tall for the age of 12, David appeared nervous and vulnerable when he joined Mountaineer High in the 7th grade. The fair-haired boy rarely spoke and was the object of some ridicule, as his grandfather insisted he always have his shirt buttoned right up to the top, unlike the other boys who had theirs unbuttoned, and David soon found himself bullied by his schoolmates. I used to defend him because the other kids would pick on him, remembered Audie Miranda, who lived on the neighbouring ranch to the Rays. He was very docile, and even though he could defend himself, he didn't believe in violence. One day on the school bus, someone pushed David too far, and he finally lashed out. I said, "Leave him alone," said Miranda. "You don't know him." They were pulling his hair, and he just turned around and tried to hit them back. When the bus driver saw what was happening, he immediately stopped the bus and broke up the fight. But the incident led to a close friendship between David and Audie, who began to play together between classes. They were soon spending weekends together at the Ray Ranch, riding horses, playing cowboys and Indians, or having extended games of hide-and-seek in the desert. Even as a young boy, David craved the outdoor life, collecting stones and fossils or anything else that caught his interest. But Audie always felt that his friend was deeply affected by his grandparents' harsh upbringing. They were devout Christians who instilled fundamentalist religion into David and Peggy, and Old Man Parker wouldn't hesitate to beat the Ray children if they didn't live up to his high standards. His grandfather was very, very strict, said Miranda, who was also frightened of him. He came from the old school, where he had to be tough to survive. If his grandfather wanted David to do something, he'd jump. Maybe in today's terms he was abusive, but we called it being strict. During the 6 years David and Peggy lived at their grandparents', their father only visited twice. Nettie would occasionally come to see them, but there seemed few maternal bonds between her and her children. Looking back, Peggy recalled that her elder brother could be ornery at times, but she still has fond memories of their childhood together. He was a loner, said Peggy. He spent a lot of time to himself. We lived way out in the country, so really it was just the two of us, not a lot of friends or anything. We got along pretty good. When David was 13, his life changed when his grandparents gave him a Cushman pacemaker motor scooter. He soon discovered a natural gift as a mechanic, and before long he could take it apart and then reassemble it. The once timid boy gained a new confidence in life, as the school friends who once mocked him now needed him to service their bikes. Suddenly brimming with confidence, David claimed that then-current teenage American music heartthrob Johnny Ray was his cousin. He would try and convince me of it, but I never believed it, said his former school friend Bill Huckabee. Even as a young teenager, there was a far more sinister side to David Ray, one that would have shocked his friends and family. Years later, he would impassively tell an FBI criminal profiler how he had first been drawn to the shadowy world of sadomasochism and torture at the age of 13. Even as a virgin, he had begun to fantasize about the delights of tying women up and then torturing them. His sister Peggy says she first discovered her older brother's strange fascination with bondage after finding some pornographic photos and drawings hidden in his room. But when she confronted him with it, he just laughed, saying it was his new hobby. Not considering it a problem, she never asked him about it again. Years later, his fiancée, Cindy Hendy, would tell the FBI that Ray had boasted of committing his first murder as a young teenager, saying he tied a woman to a tree and then tortured her to death. Criminal profilers say that people like David Ray, who are naturally drawn to bondage and domination, exhibit murderous signs from a very young age. The serial killer's first murder is an experience of intense physiological arousal, wrote psychologist Dr. Jeremy Anderson in his 1994 paper, Genesis of a Serial Killer, Fantasy's Integral Role in the Creation of a Monster. Dr. Anderson explained, "There is great pleasure centered in the exertion of power and control over the victim. The killer is at his peak. Sexually sadistic fantasies help to control the child's fears and act as an outlet for hostility and aggression. These aggression-centered fantasies, initially a form of escape for the child, come to serve as a substitute for the child's sense of mastery. In other words, the child learns to depend on the fantasies for feelings of control over self and over the external world." According to Dr. Anderson, who has closely studied the early years of Ted Bundy and other killers. Most serial murderers share an unstable childhood without a father figure. Virtually all serial killers reported childhood punishment and discipline as unfair, hostile, abusive, and very inconsistent, wrote Dr. Anderson. The primary caretakers of the future killer, be they parents, grandparents, or legal guardians, are simply bad at their job. Dr. Anderson also noted that serial killers never bond to their families and are incapable of making friends or having lasting relationships with men or women. At school, David Ray would often be teased by his friends for being unusually shy of the opposite sex. Girls would talk to him and he'd turn red, remembered Audie. I don't know if something happened to him in high school that made him change, that we knew nothing about. By the age of 15, David Ray was 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 84 pounds, and had perfect vision. A year later, his school records showed he'd added 10 pounds and was approaching a height of 6 feet. Ray's 1955 school grade average was D, with his best marks for science, reading, and vocabulary. He was not particularly athletic and disliked sports, apart from the odd game of catch with Audie. His only noteworthy achievement was a year playing trumpet in the Mountaineer High School band. I hardly even remember him as a student, said his former teacher Layla Holland. He was just the usual nice little boy who lived with his grandparents on their cattle ranch. I can't remember him causing any trouble. David Ray's 1956 Mountaineer High School sophomore year picture shows a handsome teenager with a blonde crew cut, buck teeth, and a wide smile. Noticeably, he is also the only boy to have his shirt buttoned right up to the top. In the mid-50s, Mountaineer High School was a racial mix of Mexicans and Americans who coexisted uneasily together. Both groups mainly kept to themselves, rarely mixing socially. David was real quiet and real reserved and stayed with the Anglos, recalled his former classmate Manny Gutierrez. I never remember him causing any problems or nothing. Today, David's sister Peggy is far better remembered than he is. Their old classmates still recall that she was one of the prettiest and most popular girls in her class, with her freckles and blonde red hair. In the summer of 1957, their grandmother died suddenly, and the two Ray children were split up. David was taken out of Mountaineer High School mid-semester without graduating and moved to Albuquerque to live with his mother. Peggy remained in Mountaineer, where she went to live with a local family in town before going on to graduate. We all thought it was strange that Peggy didn't go and live with her mother, said Audie Miranda. I never ever heard from David again after he left. That is, until I read about him in the newspapers, more than 40 years later. Chapter 10. July 4th weekend. It was a bright, sunny Tuesday morning as Marie Parker woke up in the back of her car and found Greg already eating breakfast. He invited her in for coffee, saying he had gone to bed at 3 a.m. the previous night and hadn't heard her knocking at his door. Leaving Greg's house, Marie collected Sierra and Kathleen, driving straight back to the campsite at Elephant Butte Lake. There she picked up her 2 young brothers and Michael and took them to breakfast at the Kettle Top restaurant. During the meal, a friend of Marie's named Vicky met up with them. After breakfast, they all returned to the tent and went bathing in the lake. The blazing New Mexico sun poured down on the towering mountains behind the lake, and the vast cloudless sky was pale blue. The children splashed and swam in the gentle currents as warm winds caressed the wild desert shrubs that grew along the beach. Later that morning, Cynthia Simonson came to collect Michael, and Marie told her how Cliff Arthur had assaulted her. Cynthia was furious, and told Marie that she had to do something about it, driving her straight to David Parker Ray's home to enlist Jesse's help. When Jessie Ray heard the story, she was sympathetic, agreeing that something must be done. Listening in on the conversation was Marie's old boyfriend Roy Yancey, who was staying over for the July 4th weekend with his disabled veteran father, Martin. Then Jessie, her friend Pablo Nuames, Marie, and Cynthia drove 20 miles south to Arthur's house in Hillsborough to confront him. Arthur was just waking up at midday when they walked straight into his house. Arthur, whose mother worked for the Parks Department, would later tell police that Marie had brought a bunch of people to kick my ass. They were acting like they were going to jump me. Denying that he had done anything to Marie, Arthur claimed his friend John Johnson had been messing around with her. He's the one who was hitting on her, said Arthur, adding that Marie was drugged up at the time and not thinking straight. On the way back to Elephant Butte, Cynthia told Marie to go to the police, but the troubled girl was hesitant, saying it wouldn't do any good and just piss everybody off. Finally, Cynthia persuaded Marie to lodge an official complaint at the Elephant Butte State Park Ranger Station at the boat training center, and when Ranger Tremco heard the allegations of sexual impropriety involving the son of a state park employee, he immediately called in the New Mexico State Police to avoid any conflict of interest. At 1 p.m., New Mexico State Police Officer Penny Ryan arrived at the boathouse to interview Marie Parker. After hearing her story, Officer Ryan asked Marie if she was prepared to testify in court against Arthur. Marie said she was. "Yeah, I don't want him to be able to get away with this," she said. "I mean, they think they can do this. There's all kinds of guys that think they can do whatever they want." Ryan then asked if she had anywhere else to stay in case of further trouble. When Marie said she was homeless, Ryan suggested moving to a different part of the beach. That was impossible, she explained to the police officer, as she was presently living on David Parker Ray's campsite. It was almost 3 in the afternoon when Officer Ryan took Parker to Sierra Vista Hospital to be examined for any injuries. While the doctor was with Marie, Officer Ryan began making inquiries of her own. She interviewed Parker's younger brother Tommy, who said he was in the tent sleeping when the incident happened, but did not see anything. Michael Culpepper also said he had not witnessed it either, as he too had been asleep. At 5:30 p.m., Ryan and her superior officer, Sergeant Gregory Richardson, arrived at Elephant Butte to interview Jessie Ray. They found her at her father's campsite at Hot Springs Cove and asked her what she knew of the alleged assault. Jessie explained to the officers that Marie had moved into her tent the day before and appeared messed up, although she had not personally seen her take any drugs. She had seen Arthur when he'd arrived at her campsite, and although he was kind of flaky, she didn't think he would molest Parker. Jessie added that she thought Marie was getting friendly with Johnson. Receiving directions to Arthur's house from Jessie, Ryan and Richardson drove to Hillsborough, but there was no one home. So after checking with his neighbors, they left a message for him to come to the state police office to make a statement. On Thursday, July the 3rd, Marie spent the day around Elephant Butte, sleeping in Jessie's tent and sunbathing on the beach. In the early afternoon, she went to the gas station, where she ran into Desert Journal publisher Bill Johnson, who was delivering his weekly newspaper in Elephant Butte. "She asked me for change so she could make a phone call," remembered Johnson. "She was clad in a really skimpy bikini, and I thought maybe she'd been on some kind of binge." The genial newspaperman asked Marie how her mother was, as she was sick with cancer at the time, and was surprised when Marie said she hadn't seen her for months. "It was a strange relationship between her and her mum," said Johnson. "She always seemed to avoid answering questions about her." About half an hour later, Johnson returned with some change for Marie, but found her deep in conversation with a scraggly-haired man, giving him her telephone number. Johnson did not want to interrupt them, and left to continue his deliveries. The July 4th weekend is one of the high spots in the Elephant Butte social calendar. Every year there is a 2-day celebration in Elephant Butte State Park, culminating in a stunning firework display over the lake at dusk. As more than 100,000 visitors were expected to attend the town's celebrations, David Parker Ray was busy keeping the park's machinery oiled and running throughout the holiday weekend. Jessie Ray's weekend beach party started on Thursday night and would go through until Sunday. She and her party co-host, Pablo Nuales, had invited about 15 of their friends, who would come and go over the 3-day period. Marie Parker and her brothers had little privacy in the tent once the party began. There was loud rock and roll music everywhere as hot dogs and chicken breasts were cooked on the barbecue, and there were endless supplies of beer, wine, and drugs. Soon the parties overflowed onto the lake, where Jessie was taking selected guests out on her father's sailboat, while others rode around on jet skis. Everybody was having a good time, said Jessie Ray's friend Deborah Fisk, who attended the party with her young son. It was just a typical big weekend. Marie Parker and Dennis Yancey also rekindled their relationship at the party over some crank. As Yancey's wife Christina was out of town for the weekend, they soon hooked up and became a couple again. The high spot of the festivities was the 9 o'clock fireworks display off Rattlesnake Island, in the center of the lake. For half an hour, a non-stop cacophony of colorful pyrotechnics lit up the clear, black velvet sky over Elephant Butte Lake and could be seen for miles around. But soon after the fireworks subsided, David Parker Ray suddenly arrived at his tent, furious to see the terrible mess left behind by the party. For once, he lost control in public, yelling at Jessie in front of all her guests. He told her that the campsite was in his name, accusing her of jeopardizing his reputation with the Parks Department. He was pissed off, said Fisk, who witnessed Ray's outburst. He chewed her little butt out. Jessie and a few volunteers, including Fisk and Marie, cleaned up the site, which was littered with empty beer bottles and scraps of food. Then Jessie and Roy Yancey went back to her father's trailer to make the peace, leaving Marie alone in the tent. The following morning, Marie Parker spent the day on the beach, becoming more and more depressed. Her mother had left for a long-distance truck driving assignment, and sometime that day she went to the gas station, leaving several suicidal messages on Kate Parker's answering machine. In the first cryptic message, an obviously upset Marie told her mother that the two needed to talk about something very important that Kate would probably not like at all. When Marie called a second time, she was in tears, saying that she wanted to say goodbye, as no one would ever see her again. "I love you, and I'm sorry for hurting you," she sobbed. "I'm sorry for what I'm going to do, but I can't be hurt anymore." She then thanked Kate for being there for her, and sadly bid her goodbye. That afternoon, Faye Teakle, who often babysat Sierra and Kathleen, saw Marie walking forlornly along the beach. She had been partying all weekend, and she was looking for another party, remembered Teakle. She was going to a party at David Ray's house. I asked her where the kids were, and she said she'd left them with a lady in Williamsburg. At about 5 o'clock Saturday afternoon, Marie told Pablo Nuanez and her half-brother Tommy McCauley that she was going to Blue Water Saloon in Elephant Butte to score drugs, and would be back in 2 hours. She dropped Tommy off at a friend's house, and then drove to the bar on State Road 195 and Warm Springs Boulevard. Parking a blue Geo Metro in the lot outside, she went inside Blue Waters to meet Jessie Ray, as arranged. Soon afterward, Jessie arrived in her father's official white Dodge Ram Charger truck, with Roy Yancey in the passenger seat. 3 years later, Yancey would tell homicide detectives what happened next. According to his confession, Jessie went into Blue Waters to find Marie. A few minutes later, both women came out of the saloon and got into the truck. Then Jessie took the wheel and drove along I-25, turning off at exit 79 to Vista Memory Gardens Cemetery, where she told Marie they would meet a drug dealer. Yancey believed they had arranged the score earlier. Yancey would allege that Jessie Ray then got out of the Ram Charger and took out a handgun, brandishing it at a petrified Marie Parker. She then handcuffed Marie, who was now screaming. "Shut up, or I'll kill you," Jessie ordered, placing her victim in restraints in the back of her father's truck and ordering Yancey to ensure that she didn't escape. Yancey sat in the back, physically subduing his ex-lover, as Jessie drove back along I-25 to 513 Bass Road. It was dark as she drew up in front of David Parker Ray's double-wide trailer. Yancey alleged that he then saw Jessie take Marie into the toy box, locking it behind them. He went into the residence where his father was watching television. Later, Yancey would admit knowing that David Parker Ray's toy box was a sadomasochistic bondage chamber. For the next 3 days, according to Yancey, the two Rays kept Marie Parker imprisoned in the toy box, while she was viciously tortured and sexually assaulted. Yancey would deny ever entering the toy box while Marie was inside. On Tuesday, July the 8th, 3 days after Marie had been kidnapped, David and Jessie told Yancey that they were done playing with her, and it was time for her to go. Although Yancey now feared they intended to murder her, he still hoped they would let her go free. At around midnight, Yancey entered the toy box with the Rays and saw Marie Parker bound to a cot, naked, blindfolded and gagged. According to his later confession, Jessie Ray handed him a piece of rope saying, "You know what you're going to have to do." Then, while she was still bound to the cot, Yancey put the rope around her neck and began to choke her. Marie began to struggle as she fought desperately for her life. She wasn't dying fast enough, Yancey would later confess, saying that he placed his knee on Marie's chest for extra leverage, using all his strength to strangle her until she went limp and turned blue. It would later be alleged that Jessie Ray held a gun to Yancey's head while he strangled her, and that David Parker Ray videotaped the murder and sold it as a snuff movie. Yancey later confessed to police that under cover of darkness, he, David and Jessie Ray wrapped Marie's naked, broken body in a dark blanket and carried it out of the toy box, placing it in the rear of the Dodge Ram. Nobody said a word as Yancey lay in the back of the truck with Marie's body, as David Ray took the wheel. They drove to T.O.C. and headed north to a remote spot that Yancey recognized as Monticello Canyon. During the drive, Yancey noticed that Marie Parker's body expelled fecal matter onto the blanket she was wrapped in. When they finally arrived at their destination, the three of them carried Parker's body out of the Charger. Then Yancey stood back and he watched David and Jessie roll the body out of the blanket, sending it hurtling off the side of a ravine. Then they got shovels out of the truck and scrambled down to the body, proceeding to bury it with loose dirt. When they finished their ghoulish work, according to Yancey, David and Jessie warned him that he would be killed if he ever told a soul what had happened. The following day, Roy Yancey, Jessie, and Yancey's father drove to Galveston, Texas, hiding out in a beachside apartment for almost a year, until they were sure Marie Parker had been forgotten. 2 days after Marie was abducted, her mother reported her missing, advising a sheriff to look at the Aztec Hotel as she hooked out of there. Marie's half-brother Tommy McCauley told police that he had last seen Marie leaving for Blue Waters for a drug deal. But for the next 2 weeks, the T.O.C. Police Department did little to try and find Marie. An officer did visit Blue Waters, where he found her Geo Metro still in the parking lot, but it was towed away before it could be searched for any clues. When Cliff Arthur and his mother walked into the New Mexico State Police Office one day after Marie had been reported missing, Officer Penny Ryan had not been told about her disappearance. As she questioned Arthur, she had no idea that T.O.C. police were searching for Parker. After reading Arthur his Miranda rights and asking his mother to wait next door, Ryan questioned him about Parker's sexual allegations. Arthur pointed the finger at his friend, John Johnson, confiding to the officer that he believed Johnson had just gotten out of prison. Calling it a case of mistaken identity, he said that Marie was unreliable, as she used drugs and got screwed up. She's always tweaking off, he confided, claiming that he himself had stopped using drugs months before. On Saturday, July 19th, exactly 2 weeks after Marie's disappearance, Penny Ryan finally found out that the girl was missing when she was asked to take over the case by T.O.C. police because of their limited jurisdiction. They gave her a list of names and phone numbers of people already interviewed, and the brief facts so far. Parker was last seen at the Blue Water Saloon, Officer Ryan would later write in her official report. It was believed that she left with 2 cowboys in a 2-tone brown pickup truck. Parker had not been heard from or seen since. Later that day, Ryan telephoned Cynthia Simonson, whom she had earlier questioned about Marie's accusations of being molested. Cynthia said she knew that her friend was missing, but had no idea where she was, adding that Parker's former boyfriend, Larry Brock, drove a brown Bronco. After putting down the phone, Officer Ryan called Marie's foster sister, Julie Lawrence, at a home in Belen, New Mexico. Lawrence said she had come to T.O.C. a week earlier to collect Sierra and Kathleen from a babysitter. They were now in foster care in Valencia County. She told Ryan that Marie would never leave town without telling her, and agreed that something was very wrong. "This is definitely very uncharacteristic of Marie," she said. "She would have come to me if she was in trouble." Lawrence told Ryan that Marie used crank and alcohol and was under the influence when Julie last saw her a month earlier. She said she had tried to get her away from her friends in T/C, inviting her to live with her in Berlin, but Marie had refused her offer. Lawrence said she suddenly remembered something odd, Officer Ryan later wrote in her report. Marie had recently got duplicate birth certificates for the girls, and she did not understand why. After talking to Julie Lawrence, Officer Ryan made one last phone call that day, to Jessie Ray. There was no answer, she later wrote, so I left a message on the answering machine. A week after Marie Parker disappeared, some of her friends started putting up missing posters with her picture all over Elephant Butte and T/C. Pablo Nuanez, one of the last people to see her alive, and who would later defend himself against rumors that he had somehow been involved in her death, said he helped organize the search. "We passed out missing person flyers," he told the Desert Journal. "I personally distributed the flyers from T/C to the Colorado state border and from T/C to Los Angeles." Dawn Allen said that she was highly suspicious as soon as she heard Parker was missing. "I called up the state police," she said, "and I told them where to look. I knew she was dead and that Jessie was involved." On November 24, 1997, Kate Parker was checking her answering machine after a long trip out of town when she discovered the 2 messages her daughter had left the day she disappeared. Parker immediately brought the tape to the state police, saying she believed her daughter might have gone to Las Vegas to commit suicide. Kate Parker told Penny Ryan she'd applied to Human Services for custody of Marie's daughters and had been going through Marie's A1 storage locker, searching for any clues to her whereabouts. Parker said it was out of character for Marie, who is usually systematic and careful, to just throw everything together in boxes, putting the girls' best dresses in with the kitchenware. Penny Ryan ended her missing persons report requesting help from the New Mexico State Police Criminal Division and telexing a nationwide alert to all law enforcement agencies. Date: 11/12/97. Request nationwide broadcast on missing person. Marie Parker. Date of birth: 03/12/75. Social Security: 044361299. Hair blonde. Eyes blue. Height 5 foot 5 inches. Weight 110 pounds. Identifiers: scar on inside of wrist. Unknown which wrist. Tattoo on buttock. Alias: Angel Morrison. Parker was reported missing on July 7, 1997. She was last seen at a bar in Elephant Butte, New Mexico. Her vehicle was recovered from the parking lot of the bar. There was no evidence of foul play. Family and friends were interviewed. No one had admitted to seeing or talking to Parker since her disappearance. Parker has admitted to using drugs in the past. Parker left 2 messages on her mother's answering machine, stating no one would see her and that she was sorry for what she was going to do. Parker may attempt to commit suicide. If any agency has unidentified female victim which fits this description, please contact this agency. Photos are available and attempting on getting dental records. Special attention: Las Vegas, Nevada and surrounding areas. Parker lived in this area before and was a suspect in a murder investigation approximately 7 years ago. Parker may be using her alias. Chapter 11. Cindy Hendy. Just days before Marie Parker was murdered in the toy box, another troubled young woman named Cynthia Leah Hendy arrived in Elephant Butte to start a new life. Although they never met, both women had much in common. The pretty, petite, blue-eyed blonde had a long criminal record due to her weakness for drugs and alcohol, and had hit rock bottom. Both had been sexually abused as young children. Now on the run from the law in Washington state for disobeying a court order to enter drug rehab, Hendy, a 37-year-old mother of 3, faced certain jail time if caught. Born on February 6, 1960, in Seattle's University District, Cindy's father was in the U.S. Navy and was frequently away from home at sea. Her mother, an aspiring model and local Seattle beauty queen, regularly entered pageants around the Seattle area. But although her family seemed happy and comparatively well off, years later, Cindy would tearfully tell a judge how she had been victimized by physical, mental and sexual abuse as a young child, which had scarred her forever. Precocious and headstrong, Cindy had little interest in school and was always near the bottom of her class, often playing hooky with her friends. By her early teens, she had developed a fondness for drugs and alcohol, disappearing for days at a time as she partied with her friends all over Seattle. After dropping out of school in the 8th grade, Cindy became pregnant at 16, giving birth to a son named Shane. But after his father left, Shane would mostly be brought up by his grandmother and assorted foster parents. In the years to come, Cindy would have 2 more children, Heather and Muffy, both by different fathers. Cindy's dysfunctional childhood had done little to prepare her for adult relationships. She was immature and always turned to drink and drugs to avoid reality. But even more dangerous was her attraction to a long line of abusive men who often beat her up. Court papers show that one of her reported 3 former husbands was a convict who later served jail time for assaulting her. Another ex-boyfriend pushed cocaine. In the late 1980s, Cindy was briefly married to Robert Hendy, even having his initials tattooed between her thumb and forefinger to go with the formation of shooting stars on her left breast. And in 1992, another husband was sentenced to more than 2 years jail time for choking and threatening to kill her. She made some real poor choices in men, said her Washington attorney Harvey Chamberlain, who defended Cindy during her numerous court appearances over the years. She struck me as a person who was prone to be victimized by violence. Friends remember Cindy as having a Jekyll and Hyde personality. When she was sober, she was a kind, considerate woman who loved reading romance novels and watching her favorite television soap operas. But once she started drinking and drugging, she became obnoxious, foul-mouthed, and so aggressive that she would pick fights with strangers in bars. Her first arrest came in 1979 for forgery and possession of stolen property. Soon she had racked up a string of felony convictions involving alcohol, drugs, and theft. Later she would boast of her criminal career, which included 5 court appearances for incidents involving domestic violence with various husbands and boyfriends. In 1990, she was charged with a felony, receiving 14 days in jail and a year's probation. 3 years later, Cindy was arrested trying to sell cocaine to an undercover sheriff's deputy in Monroe, Washington, and after admitting to a lesser charge of cocaine possession, was jailed for 30 days. Her son Shane Larson would later tell the Seattle Post-Intelligencer how his mother's life had been ruined by abusive men, alcohol, and drugs. Talking about his own tragic childhood, he explained how he and his 2 sisters only saw their mother on and off, as they'd lived in so many different homes. Most of her boyfriends liked to drink a lot, pick fights, punch her and beat her up, said Shane, who from the age of 13 was constantly in trouble with the police. According to Shane, some of Cindy's boyfriends would get high and beat him on occasion. She'd always try to make sure we didn't get hurt, he said. We've seen that our whole life growing up. And although his mother hid her heavy drinking and drug-taking from the children, as the oldest, I knew what was going on. Larson said he often begged his mother to leave her abusive boyfriends when they treated her badly, but she'd refuse, saying that they paid the bills and she didn't like to be alone. By the early 1990s, Cindy was officially classified as mentally disabled and began living off her Social Security payments. She'd now moved in with a 39-year-old construction worker in what was to prove a particularly stormy relationship. On at least 2 occasions, she filed domestic abuse charges against him, resulting in several court appearances. On July 4, 1995, the couple was arrested in Kirkland, Washington, for stealing $3,300 worth of aluminum pipes from a Department of Transportation storage shed, and Cindy was sent back to jail. On her booking slip, she was described as a 5-foot, 4-inch blue-eyed blonde, weighing just 100 pounds. Upon her release, she found it impossible to abstain from cocaine, consistently failing court-ordered random drug tests and being sent back to prison again and again. In 1996, Cindy fell for a rough-and-ready biker named John Edward Youngblood. A giant of a man, standing almost 7 feet tall, Youngblood, who always wore the same battered leather jacket, often beat her mercilessly. A few weeks after they moved in together in Everett, Washington, Hendy swore out a police complaint, accusing Youngblood of assaulting her and then kicking her out in the street. She spent the night in a pickup truck, wearing only her pajamas. But Hendy soon returned to Youngblood, and the couple continued their turbulent relationship. In the summer of 1997, Cindy Hendy was partying even harder than usual and faced hard jail time for refusing to undergo a court-ordered drug counseling course. Desperate to remain free, she went on the run, heading east to Truth or Consequences. John Youngblood, whose father lived in TLC, had told her to go there and hide out. He promised to join her as soon as she found a place to live. As a young girl, Cindy had wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps and become a fashion model, but the only modeling she would ever do was X-rated bondage shots for David Parker Ray. On arriving in Truth or Consequences, Cindy Hendy put on her best suit and went straight to the Social Services Department, asking for help. The staff was much impressed by the smartly dressed, well-groomed 30-something woman, telephoning the Marina Suites Motel in Elephant Butte, which provided temporary accommodation, to see if there was a vacancy. Social Services said they had a lady who was new to the area and asked if she could stay at the motel, said its English-born manager, Jean Clark. We said yes. That afternoon, Clark personally helped Hendy move her meager belongings into her 2-room suite and mini kitchen at the marina, which bills itself as a home away from home. She was impressed with the attractive young woman and took her under her wing. She was a very smart young lady, remembered Clark. Makeup, nice clothes, hair always immaculate. She didn't know many people, and she'd come here for a new start to get away from past drug use, etc. As Clark, who was in her late 40s, had experienced counseling HIV patients who were also drug addicts, she sympathized with Hendy, deciding to help her straighten up her life. It was just like a support thing, said Jean, who had herself arrived in Elephant Butte only 2 months earlier. I was new to the area, and I didn't know any other girls in town. But I'm also one of those people who always helps somebody that's down on their luck. About 2 weeks after Hendy arrived, she was joined by John Youngblood. They had to leave Marina Suites, as Social Services would not accommodate a couple. So Hendy and Youngblood moved into a small bubble tent by the lake at Elephant Butte, with a new kitten that Cindy had been given. On August 2nd, 1997, Jean married her boyfriend, John Branner, and Hendy and Youngblood were witnesses. Over the next few weeks, the couples frequently socialized together, but Jean began to notice a change in her friend, who seemed to be under Youngblood's control. She went back to alcohol pretty badly, said Jean. She would get any pills or any drugs she could. I knew she used to do the crank or coke. When she was in a real distressed state, she would never admit to me that she was back into it, but I strongly suspected. That September, Hendy filed a domestic abuse complaint against Youngblood. She later withdrew it, admitting that she had deliberately smashed a teapot over her head and told police he had done it. Jean Branner, who lived within hearing range of the tent, was often kept awake at night. They had some really bad fights, she said. It was pretty volatile. We'd often hear a lot of arguing, shouting and banging coming from the tent. It seemed that once that relationship flared up, everything went from bad to worse. Often drunk and unpredictable, John Youngblood also had a highly contentious relationship with his father. On one occasion, the two had an argument as his dad was driving along I-25 at 60 miles per hour. Youngblood became so angry that he opened the passenger door, jumping out of the car and seriously injuring himself. Soon afterward, police were called to the tent by neighbors to break up a fight between John and Cindy. Then Youngblood left town, moving to Arizona, where he was soon living with a new girlfriend. Now on her own, Cindy Hendy began frequenting the local bar scene, quickly establishing a reputation for herself as a hardcore partier, extreme even by TLC standards. She openly boasted of being an ex-con, delighting in comparing a criminal record with strangers in the bar. Wanting to be closer to the action, Cindy moved out of the tent and into a battered old trailer, which had no electricity or hot water, at 1603 Corzine Street off Morgan Street, TLC, and dived headfirst into the town's party scene. We called her Six-Pack Cindy, said one of her friends, George Padilla. She would go with any guy in a heartbeat if he'd buy her a drink or give her some crank. During early 1998, Padilla got to know Cindy well as they regularly hung out together with the town's fast crowd. I heard she'd been in jail, he said. She was always on drugs, and she had a crazy thing about cigarettes. She chain-smoked and always had to have one, otherwise she'd go wacko. Hendy was rumoured to support herself by trading sexual favours with a local businessman for money. One prominent store owner even took her on a gambling weekend to Las Vegas, but threw her out of their hotel room half naked after she got drunk and lost control. She later complained that he had given her a sexually transmitted disease and threatened legal action. She once told me that she didn't ever have to worry about getting arrested, as she had something on most of the police and business people in this town, remembered Jean Branner. I never took it seriously at the time, but now I wonder. Branner could only watch helplessly as she saw her friends spiral out of control into an abyss of alcohol, sex, and drugs. She was on the downhill road, said Jean. It got to the point where I didn't want to give her $5 or $10 or gas money because I knew what she was doing with it. Drugs. As Branner got to know her better, she realized that Cindy had serious mental problems. It came out with the strange sexual behavior, she said, the S&M, lesbianism and nymphomania. She had told me about her sexual abuse as a child by family members and what a rough childhood she'd had. And Jean even began to suspect that Cindy was having an affair with her husband, John Branner. One night she was partying in a trailer south of Broadway here on the main drag, said Jean. My husband never came home that night. I had to pick him up at 9:30 a.m. the next morning because he'd stayed all night with her. But at the time, she never confronted Cindy about her suspicions, and the two remained friends. Chapter 12. Bass Road. David Parker Ray was a creature of habit, seldom straying from his daily routine. Every morning he got up early and drove the short distance to the Diamond Shamrock, where he breakfasted with his state park colleagues before starting work. He came in every morning at 7:30 a.m. like clockwork, remembered Faye Teakle, who regularly served him. He always ordered a coffee and a pack of cigarettes, and he seemed nice and very normal. He was an avid fisherman and was always talking about it. After breakfast, he'd clock in for work at the ranger station in Elephant Butte State Park, spending his days tinkering around with vehicles and maintaining park equipment. Initially, he seemed standoffish and aloof to his fellow workers, but then something happened in 1997 which appeared to give him a new lease on life. He discovered Viagra, explained fellow ranger Mike Buss, who got to know Ray well. He got much more friendly when he started taking it, and he'd tell us how he'd been up all night having sex like a young stud. Ray's overnight transformation surprised his colleagues, who had always considered him a somewhat dull loner. Suddenly, he gained a new confidence, and his personality and appearance underwent a dramatic change. He started wearing turquoise jewelry and cowboy hats, said Buss. He was suddenly very full of himself. Ray's bosses viewed him as a dedicated, hard worker who could be counted on to get the job done, and after he was appointed Employee of the Quarter in June 1995, he was mainly left to his own devices with little supervision. Ray was a good employee, said his supervisor Jerome Madrid, the park's regional maintenance manager. He could always be found with his nose in some project or other. There were really no clues or hints that there was anything amiss. But other rangers remembered David Ray as a scrounger who would often take park equipment home to use for various unspecified projects. Later, the FBI would conclude that much of the patented torture equipment found in his toy box was constructed from Elephant Butte State Park equipment. He was just a pack rat, said Buss. If he'd find a 2x4 by the side of the road, he'd bring it home. His place was full of junk. It was also full of electrical equipment like scanners, radios and stuff. He was big into that. Ray also volunteered for overtime, and on his days off he would go camping in neighboring parks all over New Mexico. Over the years, he developed an expert knowledge of every nook and cranny of Elephant Butte State Park, probably knowing it better than anyone else. In summer 1998, Roy Yancey and Jesse Ray felt confident enough to leave Galveston and return to Truth or Consequences. The search for Marie Parker had ground to a halt, as police moved on to other more pressing matters. Jessie moved back into her father's trailer, and Yancey rented a run-down apartment in an old building on 4th and McAdoo behind the police station in downtown TRC with his old friend David Riviera. He used to tell me how he and Jessie had lived on the beach in Galveston with the homeless, said Riviera. They thought the whole thing about Marie had blown over, as no one suspected then that she had been murdered. Yancey found a labouring job working for a small fencing company, and he and Jessie Ray were soon back on the TRC bar scene, where they inevitably met Cindy Hendy. Before long, the three were hanging out together, and Hendy began dating both Yancey and Jessie in a strange three-way relationship, often using David Ray's trailer as a love nest. Roy told me that Cindy liked him to handcuff her and beat her up, said Marty Lamp, who worked with Yancey running fences, becoming close friends with him over the summer. Well, what he didn't know was that she expected him to be tied up too, and he didn't want that. He said he would wake up to find himself handcuffed, with Cindy wanting to beat him. Most nights after finishing work, Yancey would arrive at Marty's and his wife Terry's trailer to drink beer and watch videos. But one night, a few weeks after they'd first met, Yancey took Marty to David Ray's trailer to borrow a spot welder. They arrived to find Cindy Hendy in the kitchen preparing dinner with a female friend of Ray's named Angel, who had a shaved head and numerous tattoos. Roy introduced me to David and said he was a park ranger, remembered Lamp. He seemed like a very well-organized person by his demeanor and the way he acted, but then over dinner, Roy showed me some Polaroids of him and some naked girls. The best description I can come up with is abstract sex. He said, "Oh, look at these pictures we took the other night." I'm not sure if David was in the pictures, but I definitely recognized Cindy. Marty became uncomfortable as the two girls started describing an orgy that had taken place in the trailer the night before, inviting him to attend the next one. They just sort of shared each other, said Marty, and they'd keep making references to their little orgy or free-for-all, as they put it. During this period, David Ray and his daughter Jessie became friendly with many young TRC women, who would later claim that these were purely platonic relationships. Peggy Jones, the teenager who had helped Jessie write her editorial about the sad plight of Ziggy the Bird, got to know the Rays very well, even moving into Bass Road for a week when she once needed a place to stay. "I used to call him Dad," she told Desert Journal editor Bill Johnson after the case broke. "I knew he was a pervert, but he left me alone." The pretty brunette said she never saw anything weird happening while she lived there, or felt uncomfortable. She would often go sailing on Elephant Butte Lake with the Rays on what they called Ladies' Day. It was only women allowed, and no men except David Ray, Jones explained. On one particular expedition, they sailed north past Black Bluff Canyon and Mitchell Point, where David Ray began pointing out the deepest parts of the lake, which can go down to 200 feet. Then suddenly he began describing the best way to dispose of a human body in the lake. According to Peggy, Ray advised opening up the chest of a corpse and then filling it with rocks as ballast. After binding the chest cavity tightly with chicken wire, the body could then drop to the bottom of the lake, where it would stay. Peggy noticed a strange glint in his eye as he joked that the catfish would enjoy a 3-star meal. "He begged me not to walk out alone by the lake," said Peggy, who was amazed to see Ray's eyes begin to tear. "He told me 200 girls a year have something happen to them out there. It could have been his guilty conscience that led to his tears." On another sailing trip, Ray suddenly tied a sail rope around her ankle in a naval knot, saying, "I've got you now." At the time, Peggy took it as a joke, but later she began to wonder whether Ray's jibe had more serious overtones. Another pretty blonde teenager, named Raina Pesh, along with her best friend Amber Mitchell, also went on several sailing trips with the Rays. Raina, who'd moved to TRC in 1997, was soon befriended by Jessie Ray and began hanging out at the Bass Road trailer. "She's a good friend," remembered Raina. "She had a nice bike, and we used to go riding out to the lake. Me and Amber used to go sailing on the boat with her and her father. He was a really good guy, and I called him Dad. We'd go out to Kettletop and just hang out. It was fun." Even though she was underage at the time, David Ray would buy Raina beers and be extremely generous, never asking for anything in return. He bought us anything we wanted, she said. We went to his house a few times and drank a beer, but that was it. He was a very clean-cut person, and I never felt scared. Her friend Amber Mitchell remembered Ray producing a sexy thong bikini on one boating trip and asking Rayner to wear it. He just liked to watch us jump off the rocks into the water where we docked the boat, said Mitchell. He pretty much kept to himself, didn't talk much or anything. Rayner looked up to the older Jessie as a mentor, often seeking her advice over boyfriend problems. She didn't take shit from anyone, said Rayner. Once she helped me out in a case where a bunch of girls wanted to fight with me. She told them to back off and leave me alone, and they did. Soon after returning to TRC, Roy Yancey embarked on a homosexual affair with his roommate and longtime friend David Riviera. When they moved in together, Riviera was going through a messy divorce, and Yancey had separated from his wife Christina, who was now living in New York. First we were roommates, said Riviera, and then we became lovers and experienced our gay life together. I thought he was a cutie, and we fell in love when we went on a trip to Denver to pick up a car. Of course, we had to be very secretive, as this is a small town. Riviera, 38, feared that his lover's close relationship with the Rays was dangerous, advising him to break away from their influence. But Yancey insisted that they were cool, and could always be relied upon to put him up if he ever got stuck in Elephant Butte. One night, while they were drinking, Riviera told Yancey how his estranged wife had spitefully sold his car. Riviera was stunned when Yancey suddenly suggested they kill her, claiming that he knew how to get away with murder. I thought he was shooting his mouth off, said Riviera. Later, I came to find out that he wasn't. One hot, humid night that August, Yancey invited Riviera and his friend George Padilla to a party on David Ray Parker's sailboat. By the time Riviera and Padilla arrived at the trailer, the party was already in full swing. David and Jessie Ray were there, along with Cindy Hendy, Yancey, and a sometime prostitute named Angelica Montano. It was a clear full moon, as Ray led them out of the back of his spread and onto his boat, moored off his backyard. There was beer and whiskey, and they smoked a little dope and heroin, said Riviera, who stuck to beer. David put on some Pink Floyd tapes on the boombox as he sailed out into the lake. Suddenly, the party moved below deck, as the girls began taking off their clothes, with Riviera and Padilla watching in amazement. Then Montana was handcuffed by Ray as Jessie and Cindy laid her over a long table, tying restraints around her neck and legs. Roy Yancey invited his friends to join in the fun, but Riviera and Padilla declined and went back on deck. Initially, Montano, whom they suspected was on heroin, was a willing participant in the bondage play, which was being videotaped by Jessie. But then Ray brought out an electric castle prod and began shocking her genitals as Hendy held her down. He was torturing her, said Riviera. He had Cindy Hendy stick a gun into her and kept telling Jessie, "I don't want you to miss this part." I just sat around staring at the lake, listening to that goddamned heavy metal music he was playing. After they'd finished with Montano, Yancey came up on deck, appearing surprised to find his friends upset by what they had witnessed. I told him that I'd never seen anything like that, said Padilla. He said it was just a sex scene and people get off on that shit. The following day, a drunken Montano and her uncle arrived at Riviera and Yancey's apartment, looking for David Ray. Angie was too scared to go to the police, said Riviera. She had bruises all over her legs and kept saying she didn't know those people were that kooky. She was in a terrible state. According to friends, the Rays regularly brought home young female hitchhikers they had picked up from the side of the road. Peggy Jones would later claim to have seen hundreds of young girls at Bass Road during her visits. On one occasion, she was introduced to a girl from Albuquerque who went by the name New York, and her boyfriend, Peter Pan. When she came over the next time, she asked what had happened to the unusual couple. Dad said they dropped New York off in Albuquerque, said Jones, as she aggravated him. That Halloween, 1998, David, Parker, Ray, and Jessie threw a small party for select friends at 513 Bass Road, which would include a black magic sacrifice to the devil. Over the last few months, Roy Yancey had introduced Cindy Hendy to witchcraft, and she had been eagerly reading everything she could on the subject. "She told me she was heavily into witchcraft," said Jean Branner. "She once gave me some black magic books, and I took them because I didn't want to offend her, but they went straight into the trash." A few hours before the party was due to start, the Rays, Roy Yancey and Cindy Hendy, all turned up at George Padilla's trailer on 3rd Street. Cindy was really happy because David Ray had picked out a gown for her to wear for Halloween, said Riviera. "I knew something strange was up when she announced she had split up with Roy and was now with David." Riviera was amazed at Hendy's announcement, as he knew she was also having an affair with Jessie Ray. Cindy was bisexual, and she and Jessie were always together, he explained. It was crazy when she announced she was now with Jessie's father. At the trailer, Hendy began taking Polaroid photographs of everyone, but her neighbour, Mayla Moquin, who was also romantically involved with David Ray, became very jealous and threw a tantrum. A biker and mother of 2 young children, Moquin, who often stayed at Bass Road, was in her late 40s and considered the younger woman a direct threat. When David Ray announced that they were leaving to set up his Halloween party, Riviera, remembering what had happened on the lake, made an excuse not to go. "I didn't want to get involved in any of that stuff," he said, "and I told Roy he should stop seeing these people, as they were no good." In late November, Rick Hart, who managed a local grocery store and ran a photographic studio as a sideline, was commissioned to take wedding pictures of his friends Diane and Roy Lamb, who also happened to be Cindy Hendy's landlords. The tall, tattooed photographer was a born-again Christian who specialized in tasteful, intimate shots. He had first been introduced to Cindy Hendy by Jessie Ray a few months earlier. So on his way to the wedding, he stopped off at Hendy's trailer and found her sitting in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup. Cindy was a sweet, nice person, said Hart, who took some photographs of her in the trailer. "She told me that she had once wanted to be a model, and I think she could have been." A few nights later, Hart brought back the developed photographs and, on entering her trailer, found David Ray and Roy Yancey already there. "She told me she would like to do some intimate shots," he said. Then she took off her clothes, and I started taking pictures of the 3 of them. For the explicit set of shots, Cindy posed naked as the boyish-looking Yancey sucked her nipple with a mischievous grin on his face, and Ray looked on approvingly. Other shots show a smiling Hendy posing with full frontal nudity in photos more suited to Hustler magazine. "It was the spontaneity of the situation," explained Hart. "It wasn't done for sex. It was more like college girls flashing at spring break. I'd describe it as tasteful sexy." Over the next few months, as Hart got to know the 3 of them well, he felt Hendy and Yancey were taking advantage of the far older David Ray. "I thought he was the victim," said the photographer. "I knew Cindy and Roy were both party animals, and I thought they were using him to sponsor their partying. That was my perception at the time." Chapter 13. Meltdown. At the beginning of December, John Youngblood reappeared in TLC, determined to rekindle his troubled relationship with Cindy Hendy. One night he arrived at her Corzine Street trailer without warning and persuaded her to give him another chance, promising never again to raise a finger to her. But soon they were back to their turbulent ways. Fueled by alcohol and hard drugs, the couple went on an extended binge, and Hendy's friends watched helplessly as she went into freefall, apparently hell-bent for disaster. She now boasted of shooting crank into her hands, showing off her collapsed veins as she complained of constantly being in pain. She was going downhill fast, said Jean Branner. The drink and drugs were really taking their toll. To finance their expensive habits, the couple now turned to an acquaintance of Hendy's, who was known as an easy touch. Merritt Storm, a lonely 48-year-old epileptic divorcee, had won a large court settlement in Kansas 5 years earlier and moved to TLC to make it stretch further. "So it didn't take long for the word to get out that I had some cash," said Storm, who is a devout Christian. "And that's how I got involved with those characters." Storm had first met Hendy through a mutual friend, Angelica Montano, and considered her a severe alcoholic. Hendy became a regular visitor after Storm agreed to give her drinking money to run errands for him. She usually came in the early evening before going out drinking, and would often be accompanied by her neighbour and rival, Mela Moquin. But Storm believed that there was great tension between the women, who were constantly competing to become David Parker Ray's girlfriend. They had a tendency to fight a lot, said Storm. Mela was always breaking Cindy pretty bad, and she was angry that I helped her out. She'd say, "I've got a 10-year-old daughter. I'm the one that needs help." The situation was temporarily resolved when John Youngblood returned, and Mela moved in with David Ray. A couple of nights later, Hendy introduced her old Washington State boyfriend to Storm. John was crazy, he remembered. He was intimidating and mean, and it was like he was just looking for a reason to hurt somebody. Over the next few weeks, Storm claims to have lent the couple $600, none of which would ever be repaid. Often they would arrive late at night in a drunken stupor, asking for cash so they could carry on the party. Storm usually gave them what they wanted, just to get some peace. Nevertheless, he was concerned about Hendy's obvious decline. "I told her to get away from this guy," said Storm. "She was always doing drugs while she was around him. I encouraged her to get out." On Thursday, December 17th, in the heat of a furious argument with Youngblood, Cindy admitted that she was still sleeping with Roy Yancey. Youngblood went berserk, savagely beating her up and threatening to kill her and Yancey. Then, in a blind rage, he stormed out of the trailer, going directly to Storm's house, demanding to know where Yancey lived. "I really thought he was going to kill the guy," said Storm. "He was high on drugs or whatever and so wound up. I told him to leave my house, and quite honestly, I thought Yancey was a dead man." Cindy Hendy was so terrified that she went to TRC police headquarters, swearing out a complaint against her boyfriend. That night, in a sworn affidavit, she claimed Youngblood had threatened her and her friends with bodily injury and possibly death. "John has beaten me before 1 year ago," she wrote, "and also has beaten a friend of mine to near death behind a museum in an alley. He threatened my life. He tried headbutting me." When Roy Yancey heard that Youngblood was after him, he went on the run, arriving at Terry and Marty Lamp's trailer, pleading for sanctuary. "Roy was very upset and wanted us to hide him," said Terry. "He said Youngblood wanted to beat him up because he had been with his girlfriend. We said he could move in until things quieted down." But once Yancey and his beloved dog Coco moved into their trailer, the Lamps began to see a darker side of their friend, which scared them. He suggested they become business partners, with Marty buying out the fencing business where they both worked. He was so persuasive that the Lamps were in the process of negotiating a second mortgage with the bank, when one night Yancey drunkenly announced that he was a terrorist. Incredibly, he boasted of being a leading member of a fully armed, 200-strong New Mexico militia, saying they soon planned to move into a large fortress outside Albuquerque, and then to take on the U.S. government. "He asked us to join," said Terry. "He said they wouldn't make the same mistakes as the Freemen had made in Montana." I was flabbergasted, as we were this close to becoming his business partner. We decided not to after that. Another time, Yancey was drinking heavily while watching a detective video on the Lamps' home theater system when he began talking about murder. He said how easy it was to kill someone and then dispose of the evidence, said Marty. "We just thought he was drunk and didn't take him seriously." Just 4 days after Cindy Hendy told police that John Youngblood had threatened to kill her, he had moved back into her trailer, having persuaded her to rescind her complaint. She even wrote a letter of apology to District Judge Fitch, claiming she had made it all up. "John Youngblood has not threatened me or anyone else," she wrote, "and I am very sorry that I lied and put John and myself in trouble for no reason. I have been in counseling for manic depression, and I'm on medications, and I tend to go off for no reason. I do, and then think later. John has been working hard, and I have been working off and on, but was laid off. We love each other. Please forgive me for trying to make trouble when there was no trouble to begin with. This will never happen again. I'm going to talk to my counselor on this. I've done this before and it's going to stop, and I'm getting help. I'm very sorry that I put everyone through a lot of paperwork and your time. You certainly did not need this, and John did not need this kind of trouble either. Please think this over and reconsider and drop this so we don't have to go to court and waste everyone's time. I drink too much, and that's why I'm on medication." Adding that she was very, very sorry, and drawing a smiley face next to her signature, Hendy added a postscript asking the judge to send her his decision ASAP. After hand-delivering the letter to the district court, Cindy walked over to 610 West 3rd Street to visit a lesbian couple she knew named Patty and Trish, not their real names, who were close friends of David Ray. A few weeks earlier, the two women had rented the house from Jack Noel and his girlfriend Kathy Clark on a 3-month sublet. Cindy and the whole group were heavily into bondage and leather, Noel later told TRC Herald reporter Gerald Gardner. Tough, leather kind of stuff. They were always dabbling in S&M. About a month after moving in, Noel turned up without warning to find them painting a back bedroom completely black. When he asked them what they were doing, they replied that they were turning it into a fully equipped S&M bondage parlor. Then Cindy and David started showing up at the house and doing all sorts of sexual things, said Clark, who owns the Charles Baths in TRC. One time, Jack caught Cindy walking out of the house and she had 2 black eyes. That afternoon, a drunken Cindy and Trish arrived at Jean Branner's house in Elephant Butte, as her children were trimming the Christmas tree and putting up lights. Soon after arriving, Cindy, who was wearing a woolen green top hat, started lifting up her t-shirt and baring her breasts, which were heavily bruised from a bondage suction device. Then, as the children looked on, she started French kissing Trish. "I told her to get out," remembered Branner. "I said I don't want that kind of behavior in front of the children." She was obviously under the influence of drink, and she was bruised to death all over her boobs. It was improper behavior, and it was like she was trying to shock me and see how far she could go. I mean, she was that desperate for attention. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Merritt Storm invited Hendy and Youngblood to his house for dinner. They arrived very drunk, having had another fight after Cindy had tried to end their relationship. They were crying and very drunk when they got here, remembered Storm. John said he couldn't stand it that she was going to leave him. Storm left them in his house when he went over to his sister's for Christmas dinner. But when he returned at 11 p.m. with the leftovers, they had both disappeared. Half an hour later, Hendy telephoned from a battered wives' shelter, saying that Youngblood had beaten her up again. She'd received treatment for her injuries in Sierra Vista Hospital and was now hiding in the shelter. She begged him to bring her a change of clothes, and he went straight over. "She was beaten to a pulp," said Storm. "She was crying and terribly down." After calming her down, Storm drove her back to his house, where she started drinking and taking painkillers that the doctor had given her. Then she started talking about her sad life, becoming increasingly angry about all the men who had abused her over the years. She became like another person, and quite evil and belligerent, he remembered. She kept saying they were going to pay, and she wasn't going to take anything from anybody. It scared me. For the next 3 hours, Cindy ranted and raved, describing in detail the beatings and sexual humiliation she'd suffered since she was a little child. "It's crazy what she told me," said Storm. "They'd tie her up, beat her, defecation stuff. It was really dark. She said they forced her to do it, but I think she was probably willing to." Finally, he had heard enough and told Hendy to either leave or he'd call David Ray to collect her. A few minutes later, she asked him to make the call. Half an hour later, Ray arrived at the house, appearing genuinely concerned about her injuries. He was so polite, quiet and nice, said Storm, who had never met him before. He came over as the Sunday school teacher type, such a quiet, kind figure. After shaking Storm's hand, Ray apologized for what had happened and thanked him for calling. Then he drove Hendy back to Bass Road. The following morning, Christmas Day, David Ray swore revenge on Youngblood for what he had done. He telephoned George Padilla, summoning him to Bass Road. When he arrived, Cindy had just come out of the shower and was wearing a pink robe. Her face was covered in bruises, and one of her eyes was completely closed. A sunburned David Ray, wearing a t-shirt and cutoffs, sat by a table with a .22 pistol lying on it. He started asking me a bunch of questions about John Youngblood, remembered Padilla. He told me how John had beaten Cindy all black and blue, and that if he ever comes here, he will shoot him. Padilla told Ray that he did not know where Youngblood was and excused himself, saying he had to go and see a friend. A few hours earlier, Youngblood had arrived at Merritt Storm's house, asking to borrow $500 so he could flee to Arizona. At first, Storm refused, saying he was already owed a great deal of money. Finally, Youngblood offered to give him his favorite leather motorcycle jacket as a deposit on a $150 loan. Now, fearing for his safety, Storm agreed, and Youngblood left TRC forever. That night, Cindy Hendy turned up at Storm's house, asking to stay. Taking pity on her, he agreed, even offering to sleep on the floor so she could have his bed. She had been drinking, and she had 3 or 4 bottles of pills, he said. I asked her to stop mixing them, but she refused. As she grew more and more intoxicated, Cindy became psychotic, ranting incoherently about getting a gun and killing John Youngblood. All Storm could do was watch, as she carried on drinking wine and downing painkillers. She wanted a bath, he remembered, so I helped her into the bath and then got her clothes back on. She was that helpless, as she had taken so many pills. He then put her to bed, reassuring her that she was safe and nothing would happen to her, and went 2 blocks to the store to buy groceries. I got back in a couple of minutes, and she was just screaming blue murder, he said. So I ran into the bedroom, and I can't find her anywhere, but I can hear her screaming, "Don't hit me, don't hit me." I finally found her in the wardrobe, and she was hallucinating, so I dragged her out. Storm spent the rest of the night trying to calm her down, and it was daylight before Hendy finally fell asleep. When he awoke a couple of hours later, she was already dressed, with no apparent ill effects from the night before. She then left for a court hearing related to her earlier complaint against John Youngblood. After reading her letter, the judge gave the absent Youngblood probation, on condition that he stay out of Sierra County and never see Hendy again. His attorney, Steve Ryan, explained to the court that their stormy relationship was dominated by alcohol. Mr. Youngblood's portrayal of her was that she still wanted him, and he didn't want her, he said. By Elephant Butte standards, David Parker Ray was a good catch. With a well-paid job and no apparent shortage of money, he was a good provider. After Youngblood left town, Cindy Hendy moved in on Mayla Moquin to become Ray's girlfriend. They were fighting for David's affection, said David Riviera. There was this jealous power trip between Cindy and Mayla. They knew they wouldn't have to worry about working or where to live if they were with him. They would be secure, or at least they thought they would be. In early January 1999, Jessie Ray went to Galveston to stay with relatives, so Ray invited Hendy to move in to 513 Bass Road. She was overjoyed, believing it was only a matter of time before she triumphed over her rival. And for the next couple of months, both women lived with Ray in his double-wide trailer. On a cold morning in early January, Jean Branner helped Cindy move her belongings to Elephant Butte. She was full of expectations for the future and seemed happier than she had been in months. Cindy said she had finally met the man that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with, said Branner. He was looking after her and monitoring her drinking and money. I thought, well, that's nice. When they arrived at Bass Road, Hendy introduced Branner to David Ray, who politely shook her hand and invited her inside. He seemed a little bit shifty, she said. I always look at people's eyes. Over the next few weeks, Hendy underwent a drastic transformation, becoming a dutiful housewife. She constantly fussed over Ray, cooking him elaborate meals every night, as Mayla looked on scornfully. She was infatuated by him, said Branner. Suddenly she wanted to play house mum. She would come round to my house because she had to pass it on her way back. We'd be talking, and then suddenly she'd look at her watch and say, I've got to go. I'm going to do David's favourite dinner tonight. Strange comments like that. Well, I was actually happy for her. Later I realised I was being painted a real rosy picture. Soon after moving into the Bass Road trailer, Cindy confided to Jean that Jessie Ray, who had now returned, was jealous of her. She said that she was going to work on that because she wanted the happy family thing, said Branner. Mara Storm was also delighted for Hendy, who proudly told him that Ray had weaned her off drink and drugs. Now, when she came over to his house, it was to trade recipes to impress her new boyfriend. She came over one night and told me about David Ray and how he was good for her, remembered Storm. I told her I was so proud of her. I thought she'd found the right person. For a while, Hendy made an effort to stay sober. She spent her days reading romance novels and singing along to the hymns on the local Christian radio station, having suddenly taken an interest in religion. Appearing infatuated by David Ray, she talked of little else. She told Jean he was now encouraging her to enroll in a school in El Paso and learn to operate a grader so she could get a high-paying job with the state highways department. But slowly, Jean began to suspect that Hendy had multiple personalities. "I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've counseled a lot of people," she said. "I've seen cases of multiple personality before. She doesn't say, 'I'm Cindy today' or 'I'm Mary today,' like some people do. But one day you'd have the respectable person that was striving to succeed, and there was the sweet little housewife. Then there was the concerned mother." In early February, Hendy phoned her son Shane Larson to tell him she had met a park ranger and was now sober. "It sounded like she was doing good," said Larson. "They lived in a pretty big trailer, so they must have been doing okay." Hendy also wanted her 12-year-old daughter Muffy to come and live with them, so the little girl took the bus from Washington State to Elephant Butte for a prolonged stay. But a few days after arriving, Muffy telephoned her grandmother, begging to come home. She accused Ray and her mother of being abusive to her. Soon afterward, Muffy returned to Snohomish County, Washington, where she was placed in foster care. Over the past few months, David Parker Ray had been carefully training Cindy Hendy to help him kidnap and torture women. She'd been thrilled when he first showed her his toy box and started teaching her his specialized methods of torture. Using the tiny figures in his dioramas, he carefully demonstrated his almost scientific approach to torture. And then he made her read his own 18-point list of instructions, which he'd posted on the left wall of the toy box. Psychological and physical procedures. Initial handling of the captive personal fetish. Number 1. The new female captive should be gagged and blindfolded with wrist and ankles chained. Number 2. Move her into the recreation room. Place her body under the suspension chains. Number 3. Stand her up under the chains and lock her wrists well above her head. Number 4. Place the neck chain around her neck and lock it into place. It is permanent. Number 5. Clip her leg irons to the floor chain. Number 6. Use scissors to slowly remove her dress, blouse or sweater. Cut and remove the bra. Number 7. Fondle and abuse her breasts, nipples and other parts of her body. Number 8. Keep her blindfolded to increase disorientation. Use verbal abuse, dumb bitch, slut, etc. Number 9. Slowly unzip, open and remove the lower clothing. Cut or rip the panties off. Number 10. Fondle and abuse her sex organs. Continue the verbal abuse. Number 11. Attach the overhead suspension straps to her body, ankles, waist, hips and upper chest. Number 12. Remove the leg irons and tighten the ankle straps, pulling her legs upwards until the middle part of her body is horizontal. The ankle straps will force her legs wide apart. Number 13. Tighten and adjust the waist, hip and chest straps until the middle of her body is straight. Clip the short forechain to the bottom ring on the waist belt so she cannot jerk or lift her body upward. Number 14. At this point, the captive is suspended at a convenient height, immobilized and fully exposed. She is uncomfortable, disorientated, and probably terrified. Don't cut her any slack. Continue the verbal and physical abuse. Keep her mentally off balance. Number 15. Play with her sex organs. Rape her vagina and anus. Force large dildos deep into both holes. Use clamps, needles and other devices on her tits and sex organs. Clip and cut lips. Whip her and use electroshock. Number 16. Don't give her time to collect her thoughts. Use her body aggressively during the first hour or two. She will sweat, struggle a lot and exhaust herself, particularly if the electric shock machine is used extensively. Number 17. Intensify her fear. Tell her how she is going to be kept as a sex slave. Describe in detail how she will be continuously raped and tortured. Work on her mind as well as her body. Number 18. Keep her body suspended 2 or 3 hours. Then lower the gynecological bench directly beneath her. Lower her body onto the bench. Release one arm or one leg at a time and secure it to the bench until she is strapped down. Buckle all the straps on her body until she is totally immobilized. Feet in the stirrups and knees forced wide apart. Note: the shock value of disorientation, plus continuous verbal and physical abuse during the first few hours of confinement, will have a great influence on how docile and subdued the captive will be during the remaining period of captivity. If it is done properly, she'll be intimidated and much easier to handle. After Hendy finished reading them, Ray told her that they would soon kidnap a woman, and together they would experience the thrills and rush of torture. Chapter 14. Angelica Montano. Angelica Montano, the sometime prostitute who had been brutally tortured on David Ray's yacht, first came to Elephant Butte Lake as a little girl with her grandfather, who was a tournament fisherman. During her childhood, they often went fishing together in the sparkling clear blue waters by Kettle Top. But its peace and tranquility was in stark contrast to the rest of her turbulent youth, growing up on the mean streets of Albuquerque. Born in 1972, the tall, skinny Hispanic girl came from a broken home and had little schooling. By the time she was a teenager, Angelica was already turning tricks on Central Avenue to finance her growing drug habit and had been arrested numerous times for prostitution and drugs. In early 1998, after coming out of rehab, Angelica moved to T.O.C. to clean up her life. She found a boyfriend, Peter Harris, not his real name, who had a steady job working for a local hospital and became pregnant, giving birth to a baby boy. She struggled to survive on welfare after being classified as legally blind in one eye. Soon after arriving in T.O.C., Angelica met Cindy Hendy at George Padilla's house via the convoluted T.O.C. dating scene. At that time, Hendy was involved in a relationship with a man named Pierre Ari, who also happened to be two-timing her with Peter's mother. Cindy's relationship with Ari ended when both were arrested for domestic violence and ordered to undergo anger management and alcohol counseling in exchange for the complaints being dismissed. Cindy liked to drink, said Montano, but she seemed pretty nice. Over the next few months, Hendy became Angelica's confidant, listening to the problems she was having with Peter's mother, who didn't approve of their relationship. But deep down, the two women distrusted each other and never got along particularly well, especially when they were drinking. She was always coming over to my house as drunk as hell with Cindy, said Padilla, whose wife, Michelle, often babysat Angelica's young son. Then they would go off together. I don't know where the hell they went. After Padilla and David Riviera witnessed Angelica's ordeal on David Ray's boat, they were amazed that she remained friends with Cindy, reasoning that it must have been their shared passion for hard drugs. One night in late 1998, Angelica Montano was high when she knocked on Merritt's Storm store at 2 a.m., searching for a soda machine. She didn't know me from Adam, said Storm. I said, I don't know of any pop machines around here, but I've got some cans in my refrigerator, and you're welcome to some. That's how we got involved. Angelica was only too happy to start running errands for Storm to earn some extra money, and before long, the lonely, disabled divorcee fell in love with her. She did have a boyfriend, and told me she did not want to be unfaithful, said Storm. We never had intercourse, but we did other things. She'd do oral sex and things like that. That was okay, but she said intercourse would have been unfaithful, so I thought, okay, that's cool, On one occasion, Storm invited Cindy and Angelica over to his house for a meal, but he soon regretted it when they turned up drunk with several other friends. Cindy and Angelica totally disliked each other, said Storm. Angelica would get jealous that Cindy had been around here and say, "I want to kick her ass." But that particular night, they were sitting here talking to each other face to face. Finally, Storm got so fed up with his drunken guests that he kicked everybody out of his house. Over the next few weeks, as Montano's behavior became more and more erratic, Storm never quite knew where he stood in her affections. One time she'd be here and I'd love her to death, he explained, and the next she didn't want to know, and a lot of it had to do with drugs. There were many times, probably a lot more than I'd want to know about, that she would come here for money to buy drugs. I don't know. I tolerated it because I felt sorry for her. On Tuesday, February 16th, 1999, Angelica Montano was visiting a friend when Cindy Hendy telephoned, asking to speak to her. Montano told her it was her boyfriend Pete's birthday tomorrow, and she could not even afford to buy a cake. A sympathetic Hendy told her not to worry. She had some cake mix she could have, promising to bring it to a T.O.C. district court hearing she and David Ray were to attend the following morning. At 10 a.m., Montano arrived at the courthouse to meet Hendy, but there was no sign of her. As Montano waited by the car park, she saw several friends, including a policewoman who stopped for a chat. Finally, at about 11:30 a.m., David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy appeared, telling Montano, who was wearing a t-shirt, jeans and cowboy boots, to meet them around the corner in a couple of minutes. "I was wondering why they told me to meet them up the street," said Montano. "Maybe it was so no one would see me with them." A few minutes later, Ray drew up alongside Montano in his small truck, drawing a camper behind it. Hendy was in the passenger seat, so Montano sat next to her by the door. Then Hendy apologized, saying that she had forgotten to bring the cake mix. She suggested they all drive back to Elephant Butte and collect it. Later, she promised she would drive Montano back into T.O.C. to bake Pete's birthday cake. But during the 10-minute drive to Elephant Butte, neither Ray nor Hendy said a word. They were so quiet, Montano later remembered. They were awful quiet. On arriving at 513 Bass Road, they ushered Angelica into the trailer, telling her to make herself comfortable on a white single bed in a corner of the living room. Then Ray went outside, returning a short time later, holding a large, rusty brown box in one hand and a vicious-looking dagger in the other. "He put the knife to my throat and told me I was being abducted against my free will," she would later testify. "I didn't know what abducted meant." Initially, Montano thought it was a practical joke, but she soon understood the seriousness of her situation when Ray suddenly punched her in the mouth and Cindy took out a black pistol, holding it to her head. "I realized this was not some weird game," she later said. "My life was in danger. I am legally blind from a previous injury, but I could see the knife at my throat and Cindy pointing a pistol at me." Then Ray stripped Angelica naked as she desperately tried to reason with Hendy, asking what was going on. "Shut the fuck up," was Hendy's reply, pointing the gun even closer to her temple. Ray left the trailer again and returned a few minutes later, carrying heavy chains and handcuffs, and began to chain her to bars on either side of the bed. First, he put a silver, padlocked metal collar around her neck with a chain dangling from it, before handcuffing her wrists and ankles to the four corners of the bed. He then began trying to fit a leather mask over her head, informing her that when it was properly secured, no one would ever hear her scream. "Then they put something over my face so I couldn't breathe," she said. "I begged and pleaded with them not to, and they took it off, thank God." Totally helpless and paralyzed with fear, Angelica was then played David Ray's induction tape, warning her of what was going to happen. When it finished, Hendy forced her to swallow an orange pill at gunpoint. Cindy said, "Shall I give her one or two?" Angelica later testified. David said one. Then, Montano lost consciousness. She came to later that evening and found Ray and Hendy watching television. They blindfolded her, wrapped her in a sheet and gave her a second pill before turning out the lights and going to sleep in the back bedroom. On Thursday morning, David Ray left for work at 7 a.m., leaving Hendy to guard Montano, who was still chained naked to the bed. Cindy asked if she wanted to share a burrito, but Montano declined, as she was far too scared to eat. It would be 4 long days and nights before she would have her next meal. How could I eat at a time like that? Chained up like a dog, she said. I didn't know if I was going to live or die. For the rest of the day, Hendy guarded her captive while she watched a succession of television soap operas. But in the afternoon, Angelica started to rattle her chains, begging Hendy to set her free. I think I made her nervous, Angelica said. I was moving the chains and saying, "Open these chains. Get the keys." When Hendy told her that David Ray had taken the key to work with him, Angelica called her a liar. So we started arguing, she said. I finally shut up because she went kind of loony and started waving the gun around. That night, Ray came home from work still wearing his ranger's uniform and ate a meal Hendy had prepared. Then he took off his pants, spending the rest of the evening watching television with Hendy, naked from the waist down. I guess he was too tired to do anything, so he left me alone, said Angelica, who pretended to be asleep. Like a dog, I was chained up to a bed and naked. Later that night, Peggy Jones arrived at Bass Road with a friend to return some money she had borrowed from Dad. But when Ray opened the front door, he said he was busy and asked them to leave. He rushed us off, said Peggy, who would later realize that this uncharacteristic brusqueness was due to Angelica Montano being held prisoner inside. Over the whole time she was held captive, Ray and Hendy never once answered the telephone. And on the few occasions that Angelica had to use the restroom, Ray would unlock the handcuffs, leading her to a portable toilet by the chain on her metal collar like an animal. Before settling down to watch the first part of the Stephen King television miniseries, Storm of the Century, Hendy went to the store to buy groceries, leaving Angelica alone with Ray for the first time. I started crying, she would later remember. I said, "David, can you please come over and give me a hug and tell me everything is going to be all right?" Amazingly, her captor complied, coming over to the bed and hugging her. Then he tried to reassure her, saying that nothing bad was going to happen. After the movie finished, Hendy and Ray began discussing killing Mayla Moquin and her little boy, and then turning her 10-year-old daughter into their sex slave. Cindy wanted to take Mayla and her son out on the boat and kill them, said Montano, who overheard the conversation. Then they wanted to keep the girl as a love slave. It's incredible. They had it all planned. They also talked about a man who had been shot dead in the trailer, with Ray complaining that there was messy blood all over the place. Later, detectives would investigate if Ray might have been referring to killing his former Canal Motors boss, Billy Ray Bowers, but came up with no evidence. On Friday morning, almost 48 hours after she'd been kidnapped, Montano pretended to be asleep as she watched Hendy send Ray off to work with a kiss. It was like nothing bothered them, said Angelica. Kisses and hugs like, "Hello, there's a crime happening here." Once again, Hendy spent the morning watching soap operas and cooking, hardly saying a word to her captive. That afternoon, Angelica asked Cindy why they were doing this to her, and if she was going to die. "No, nothing will happen to you," replied Hendy coldly. That night, David Ray came home at 5:30 p.m. and took a shower before coming into the living room. Then, as Hendy held a gun on her, Ray informed Angelica that she was going to visit his toy box. Unlocking her handcuffs and chains, he then led her to the bathroom by the long leash attached to her metal collar. "He gave me a bath like a dog, with a chain and everything," she said. "He said he likes to have his victims clean." After carefully drying her body, Hendy started applying makeup to her face, saying she had to look her best for a video as she was going to be the star. When Ray was satisfied with the results, he draped a robe over her shoulder and led her by the metal collar leash out of the main trailer into the cold, dark night. It was only a few yards to the toy box, but to Angelica, who had been chained to a bed for more than 3 days, it seemed miles, as he dragged her across his yard. When Angelica entered the toy box, she could just make out various shelves and cabinets holding an array of sexual devices and videotapes. There was also a video camera and TV monitor set up directly in front of a gynecological chair. Ray locked the door as Hendy began loading the video recorder with a fresh tape. Then he blindfolded Angelica with a bandana, placing silver duct tape tightly over her mouth. Suddenly, without warning, Ray hit her hard in the stomach, forcing her onto a black table on her hands and knees. He then carefully bound her hands and feet with red leather ropes and inserted a long wooden device into her rectum. He left it inside her for an agonizing 15 minutes as he took off his pants. "I was in terrible pain," she would later tearfully remember of the device in her rectum. Then he pulled it out. She was then forced into a gynecological chair, complete with stirrups. Ray spread her arms and legs as far apart as he could, before securing them to restraints. "It was very uncomfortable," she would later testify. "I was hardly able to breathe." When Angelica begged for more air, Cindy merely laughed, saying, "Oh, she's breathing good." Montano could hear the hum of the video recorder as Ray played her his customary audio tape, smugly telling her of more horrors to come. "They played me the tape, so I didn't know what to believe," she said. "What were they going to do with me? I didn't know if I was going to see my kid again." Then Ray started attaching small metal alligator clips to her nipples and genitalia, ordering Hendy to turn on the electrical current. "I was crying and shaking in pain because it hurt so bad," she later remembered. Cindy was just asking, "How high is that?" "I know she put that sucker real high." David Ray said, "That's as high as it can get." With duct tape gagging her mouth, preventing her screaming, Angelica was totally helpless as the two sadists began to experiment with the current. Hendy repeatedly turning the dial up and down as they watched their victim writhe in pain. Then David Ray began to invade Angelica's body with an assortment of dildos. Angelica noticed that Ray, naked from the waist down, did not have an erection. Seeming to tire of the electricity generator, Ray picked up a stun gun and handed Hendy an electric castle prod. "They started shocking me with a white stun gun, and then they used that black castle thing," she said. "I was shaking. I remember shaking. Then he put something in my vagina and shocked it. It was electric. I've never felt anything like it before. I got burns on my legs and thighs." Angelica's captors fastened more clips to her nipples and attached a chain to them. Ray and Hendy took turns tugging on the ends of the chain as their manacled victims squirmed in agony. Suddenly, after about an hour of torture, Ray looked at his wristwatch and told Hendy to stop. It was almost time for the final part of Storm of the Century, and he did not want to miss it. After releasing her from the restraints binding her to the gynecological chair, David Ray led her back into the main trailer, saying, "Well, Angelica, you'll give me a good blowjob." Then, as Hendy looked on approvingly, he forced his flaccid penis into her mouth. He didn't have a hard-on, Angelica would later explain. He had to put something on, like a rubber band, to get it hard. "I made sure I gave him the best damn blowjob I could ever give, because I wanted him to like me. And that helped. He liked that." Finally, Ray ejaculated into Angelica's mouth, forcing her to swallow his semen as Hendy held her down. Traumatized, the poor girl pretended that she had enjoyed the experience so as to make Ray and Hendy like her. After Ray had finished, Angelica asked when he was going to let her go. Ray smiled, promising that she could leave the following morning. Then she lied, swearing never to tell a soul what had happened, as he was too old to go to prison. Ray assured her that after the shot he would give her, she would not remember a thing. "He believed me," she said. "I had to play the part to be their friends in order to still be alive, so they wouldn't think that I would go out and tell anybody. I had to get David Ray to like me somehow." Ray now visibly softened, telling Angelica how much he liked her as a person and that he never would have taken her had he known her better. He even let her call a friend to arrange for her bus fare to Albuquerque. After the call, which Ray carefully monitored, Angelica was handcuffed back to the bed as her two jailers sat on the couch at 9 p.m. to watch the final part of the movie. "Thank God for Stephen King," said Montano. "Boy, they wanted to watch it." On Saturday morning, David Ray got up early and came over and unlocked the handcuffs and the collar. After being chained up for 4 days, Angelica was terribly sore, and the burns from the electric stun guns were hurting. Now, Ray seemed almost paternal, making Montano a mug of coffee and giving her back her clothes. After she put on her t-shirt and jeans, Ray asked her to come over to the bed and give him a hug. "He told me everything was going to be all right," she said. "He goes, 'Don't worry, nothing's going to happen to you.' I was playing the part with him, like I was a friend. It's a good thing I did play head games with him and get him to be on my side. If I would have fought them and started being a bitch, I think I would have died." As Ray and Hendy drove her to a bus stop on the northbound exit of I-25, Angelica told them how she'd love to do it again someday. Only next time, she said, she did not want to be the victim. At about midday, Officer Gary Labor, a narcotics investigator for the Sierra County Sheriff's Department, was driving his pickup north along I-25 when he spotted Angelica Montano by the side of the freeway. She was frantically trying to flag down cars, and the plainclothes officer pulled off the road to ask if she was all right. "I need to get out of here," Montano said breathlessly, accepting Labor's offer to drive her to Albuquerque. For the first 10 minutes, they drove in silence. But then Angelica lit a cigarette, saying, "If I told you something, you're not going to believe me." Officer Labor, who was casually dressed in a t-shirt, shorts, and a baseball cap, said he'd make up his own mind. So, without realizing that he was a policeman, Montano told him about her 4-day ordeal. "She told me that she had just got away from an old pervert and a woman," Officer Labor would later testify. "They had her in a trailer like an animal with a chain and dog collar, and sodomized her with a broom handle." As she chain-smoked, Montano told him how she'd been kidnapped at gunpoint, stripped naked and shocked with an electric stun gun. She described how they put some roach clips on her nipples attached to a chain that they kept tugging, he said. "She told me there was a television monitor in the trailer where they could watch her at all times, and that she could see herself in it." Skeptical of her bizarre story, Labor asked the circumstances of how it had happened. Angelica told him a different version of the one she later told the FBI and would testify to in court. She explained that she had been partying all night with her friend Cindy, and they had ended up at David Ray's trailer in Elephant Butte. Confiding that it might have had something to do with a bad drug deal, Montano said she didn't know why her friend would have subjected her to all this, adding that she hadn't eaten since her abduction. When she finished her story, Officer Labor revealed that he was a police officer, offering to drive her back to TRC so she could file a police report. "I can't go back to TRC," she replied cryptically. "The police are involved." Labor then suggested they file a report in Socorro, where he had to stop off at the police station. Again she refused, saying nobody would believe her and that she just wanted to go to Albuquerque. Labor thought her story was so bizarre that he did not believe her. "She kept asking me, 'What should I do?' Labor would testify. "I told her that if she was telling the truth, she needed to make a police report. But if she was making it up, she could be charged with making a false police report." Lighting up another cigarette, Montano changed the subject, talking about her boyfriend Peter and her son. "She shed some tears when she was thinking about her old man," said the officer, "but she didn't seem nervous at all and smoked a lot. If I had felt she was 100% legitimate, I would have taken her to the police right then and there." After stopping off for gas in Los Lunas, on the outskirts of Albuquerque, Labor told Angelica that he couldn't drop her off at Central Avenue as he was pressed for time. He then left her by a bus stop on the Lomas exit of I-25 and drove off. 4 days later, Angelica Montano's father was gunned down in cold blood by a 15-year-old boy outside an Albuquerque Taco Bell when a drug deal went bad. Still reeling from the trauma of her recent ordeal, She broke down at the funeral in floods of tears. A couple of days before her father died, Angelica had told him how she'd been kidnapped and sexually tortured by David Ray and Cindy Hendy. Me and my father were going to kill them, she later told a reporter. Then my father died, so then I said, you know what? I'm just going to leave it up to God. Chapter 15. The Weakest Link. Any hopes for Cindy Hendy's newfound sobriety were short-lived. In the weeks following Angelica Montano's release, Cindy began drinking and drugging with a vengeance, veering out of control. And often, while under the influence, she became boastful and loose-lipped. On Saturday, March 13, 1999, Jean Branner returned to her lakefront home in Elephant Butte from Las Cruces to find her husband, John, downing wine with a very drunken Cindy Hendy. Ever since the two had stayed out all night partying together a few months earlier, Jean had been suspicious that John was having an affair with her friend. My neighbors would often see her in our place when I was at work, she said. Later they told me my husband was with Cindy. That afternoon, Cindy Hendy was in fine spirits, boasting of her new life with David Parker Ray. As she swigged white wine straight from the bottle, she suddenly confided that Ray was actually a serial murderer who had killed hundreds of women during his lengthy career. Cindy said she knew about 6 or 7 women that were in the lake, said Branner, who was horrified at the disclosure, and this was only while they had been together. They say drink makes people talk. Well, she was doing an awful lot of talking that night. The Branners listened in disbelief as Cindy told them she'd always been intrigued by serial killers and loved reading about them. Now, she proudly announced, she was actually living with one. She then told them about Ray's toy box, complaining that there was a bloodstain the size of a quarter on the floor of the trailer which she couldn't wash off. She said that was where David Ray had shot a man in the head, said Jean, but he doesn't like to do that because it's messy. Hendy then explained in detail how Ray would slit up the bodies and fill the stomachs with stones to ensure that they sunk to the bottom of the lake. This was all so bizarre, said Jean. I mean, I've never read a book with anything that could match that. Hendy said she was looking forward to suffocating the next woman herself, as she wanted to experience the ultimate rush of murder. I didn't say anything at the time, said Jean. I didn't believe a word of it, as she was clutching a bottle of wine and knocking it back, and maybe she'd been doing drugs as well. According to Hendy, Ray mainly preyed on prostitutes, drug addicts, and down-and-outs, whom no one would miss. Many of his victims were girls he'd snatched from across the Mexican border and then brought back to Bass Road to be tortured and murdered. She said there were hundreds, said Jean, and she boasted he'd been doing it for over 20 years and never been caught. But I guess his biggest mistake was Cindy, because she was the weakest link. As she was leaving, Hendy told the stunned couple that she and Ray would soon take another victim. David Ray was angry that she was going to Seattle to see her daughter Heather, who was pregnant, so in a few days' time, they would go to Albuquerque and kidnap a prostitute to amuse him while she was away. 2 days later, on Monday, March 15th, David Ray and Cindy Hendy became engaged, planning to marry in July at a ceremony by the lake. That afternoon, Hendy arrived at Rick Hart's trailer, asking him to be their official wedding photographer. That was a real sweet thing, remembered Hart a year later. She looked the best I've ever seen her, and she said it was because David Ray had gotten her off the drinking. She said David was real good for her, and she wasn't going to let this one go. That same week, Angelica Montano returned to TLC for the first time since her ordeal. Since her father's murder, she had been working as a prostitute on Albuquerque's Central Avenue and had reached rock bottom. Late one night, she turned up on Merritt Storm's doorstep in a terrible state, begging him to give her his prescribed painkillers. Earlier, she had gone to the hospital asking for Valium, but the doctor had refused, realizing that she had a drug problem. She called me beside herself, said Storm. I told her to come over. After giving her some painkillers, which she took for epileptic seizures, Angelica calmed down and relaxed on the couch, making small talk. Then her mood suddenly changed as she began telling him how Ray and Hendy had imprisoned and tortured her. I just didn't believe her, Storm would later explain. No one would have. Finally, Storm, who had taken a sleeping pill, went to bed, carefully hiding his wallet under his mattress, as he didn't trust Montana. She knew I always kept a pretty good chunk of money on me, he said. I was always pretty open with her, but one night she had stolen some pain pills from the top of my medicine cabinet. I finally realized I was trusting her too much. When he awoke the next morning, Montana was gone, and his wallet was missing. Feeling hurt and betrayed, he telephoned her, telling her to return his wallet. She kept denying it, said Storm. I told her to bring my money back, or I'd make things really tough on her. She would not give it back. Storm then went to the welfare department, telling them that he had given her at least $3,000 over the last year, but he was informed that Montano had recently been taken off welfare, as she no longer qualified. A couple of days later, apparently forgetting all about the wallet, Montano was back at Storm's house, asking for money. When he refused, she angrily declared, "I'll make a living on my back," and stormed off into the night. Chapter 16. Cynthia v. Hill. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, March 20th, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy set off in their white Toyota pickup and camper for Albuquerque. Ray had finally persuaded Hendy to postpone her visit to Washington to see Heather, saying that she wouldn't want to miss out on the excitement of snatching a new slave. While he drove north on I-25, through the flat, arrow-straight highway with its endless lunar landscapes of sand and cactus, Ray methodically reeled off a checklist of essentials: stun gun, knife, handcuffs, restraints, police star, leather mask, metal collar, and chains. It was midday when they arrived in Albuquerque, going straight to a parking lot on Washington and Central Avenue, which was frequented by prostitutes. He stopped at a small convenience store nearby, telling a pimp named Terry that he wanted a girl for a blowjob. Terry told him to wait in the RV, and he'd send a girl out to meet him. A few minutes later, an attractive 22-year-old dark-haired woman named Cynthia V. Hill walked into the parking lot and got into Ray's RV, where they made a $30 deal for oral sex. He wanted to pay money for a blowjob, she would later testify, saying she needed money for drugs. Minutes later, she entered the back of the camper, where Ray suddenly pulled out a silver badge and told her she was under arrest for solicitation. Then, as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs, Cindy Hendy came out of the restroom brandishing a white stun gun, announcing that she'd recorded everything on tape. As V. Hill made a desperate attempt to escape, Ray and Hendy laid into her and threw her to the floor, where she noticed a knife and several other weapons hidden under a cushion near the front of the camper. She started pulling my hair and kicking me, said V. Hill, until they finally got me handcuffed and shackled. Then Hendy drove out of the parking lot down Central Avenue, as Ray duct-taped Cynthia's mouth and placed shackles around her ankles, attached to eye screws on the wall of the truck. A few minutes later, on I-25, Hendy stopped on an exit ramp to switch places with Ray, who did the rest of the driving. "The lady told me all they were going to do is rape me and let me go," said V. Hill. She was drinking. To V. Hill, it seemed like an eternity as she lay in the back of the camper. There was a large sheet partitioning off the front of the camper from the back, with drawn curtains across both windows, so she had no clue in which direction they were traveling. Armed with a knife, Hendy sat next to Cynthia, sipping on a bottle of wine. V. Hill could hear her captors talking, referring to each other by their first names, David and Cindy. Eventually, they stopped at a gas station, and Hendy went to buy cigarettes and more wine. On her return, she joined David Ray in the back of the camper, and they ordered Cynthia to strip naked, threatening to shock her with a stun gun if she resisted. "They made me take off my clothes," she later remembered tearfully. "They put a black leather mask over my head with a zipper over the mouth. There were no holes for the eyes or the nose." Then, after tying V. Hill's wrists to her ankles with rope, Ray got back in the front of the pickup and carried on driving, as the terrified girl closed her eyes, trying to blank out the abject horror of what was happening. It was still daylight when the pickup truck drew into David Ray's yard and parked alongside his trailer. Hendy started untying the ropes, but left the shackles and handcuffs on. Then they maneuvered their victim through the front door and into a den, situated in the middle of the trailer. They threw Vihil onto a bed and tied her legs and arms to each of the four corners. Then she put a metal collar with a padlock and chain around my neck, Vihil later testified. I laid on the bed for a while. A few minutes later, she heard a cassette tape recorder being turned on, and David Ray's soft, eerie voice coming through a tinny speaker, sending a shiver down her spine. "Hello there, bitch," it hissed. "Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disorientated and scared too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances." Paralyzed by fear, Vihil helplessly listened as Ray explained how he and his lady friend would torture and rape her in every possible way, saying that, as far as he was concerned, she was just a pretty piece of meat. After the 5-minute tape finished, Ray wheeled a small portable generator with a bunch of wires attached to it into the den. Then, as Hendy waved a small revolver, threatening to shoot Cynthia if she tried to escape, Ray picked up the dildos. "He stuck one in my rectum," she later told prosecutors. "And while that was in my rectum, he stuck another thing that was real big and had measuring lines down one side into my vagina." The woman with the gun just stood there watching. After Ray finished with the dildos, he and Hendy began attaching electrodes from the generator to Vihil's nipples and genitalia. Then Ray moved the dial to its highest level. He turned the machine on, and it sent shocks through my body, she said. The shock treatment went on for about half an hour. After they'd finished with the electricity, Ray removed the electrodes and began preparing Vihil for the next terrible phase of torture. He placed a metal bar between her knees, forcing her legs wide open. As Hendy watched, he handcuffed Vihil's wrists and wrapped a connecting chain around her legs. Cynthia could only watch in horror as Ray went into the kitchen and returned with a can of gravy and dipped his fingers inside it. "He put gravy up me," she sobbed, "and then he brought in a dog from the outside and made the dog lick me." After they had finished, Ray and Hendy unshackled Vihil and took her back to the bed, securing the padlocked metal collar to the wall by its long chain. Then they left the den to watch television in the front room. "I slept all night," she remembered. "All I wanted to do was sleep. I didn't want them to come in." When Cynthia woke up Sunday morning, it was already light outside. She lay there for a long time, praying that it had all been a horrible dream and she would soon wake up. At around midday, Ray and Hendy came into the den and unchained the manacles on Vihil's arms and legs, leaving the metal collar in place. Then David Ray grabbed the chain and led her to the bathroom, holding a revolver to her head. After Cynthia relieved herself, Ray brought her into the back bedroom, where Hendy was already waiting. He placed her on the white bedsheets and duct-taped her mouth and eyes. He then hog-tied her, using an elaborate collection of leather straps that were all connected together. Attaching a rope through the center of the straps, Ray threaded it into an overhead hook in the middle of the trailer ceiling and through a system of pulleys. Then he suspended Vihil's entire body 3 feet off the floor, leaving her hanging in midair. In one sudden motion, Ray ripped the duct tape from her eyes, and Cynthia found herself looking into a video monitor at her own horrified face. "He hung me from there, and split my legs apart with these orange ropes," she recalled, "and he whipped me with a leather belt and a load of whips and a cat-o'-nine-tails." The savage beating appeared to sexually excite Ray, who walked over to a glass cabinet where a collection of various dildos were displayed on a trophy stand. He then took out one horrendous-looking dildo and approached his helpless victim. It had pokey things going up it at the bottom, she later testified, sobbing. Then right below that, it had pokey things that went out at the side, and he stuck it in my vagina. Then, as Hendy egged him on, he inserted another dildo into her rectum and took some Polaroid photographs from various angles. After Ray had satisfied himself, he lured Vihil onto the floor, untied her, and led her back to the den, re-securing her dog collar to the wall over the bed. By now, the poor woman was so disoriented that she had no idea whether it was day or night. Every time Cindy and David left the room, Vigil would curl up on the bed and pretend to be asleep, praying they would just leave her alone. Later that day, Ray and Hendy came back to the den and shook her awake. They brought her into a bedroom at the rear of the main trailer and tied her down on a bed with white sheets. Then, with Hendy holding a gun to her head, Ray duct-taped Vigil's mouth and attached clamps to her breasts. These were connected to a chain going up through a pulley system. Half-inch steel rods bolted to the ceiling supported the elaborate set of pulleys, which were connected to lead weights that slid down if any pressure were exerted on the clamps now connected to her breasts. By the side of the pulleys, Ray had neatly lettered 2 signs reading ankle spreader and knee spreader. Now naked from the waist down, Ray picked up his white stun gun and proceeded to shock Vigil's thighs and legs. At every time the blast of electricity sent her body writhing in pain, Vigil would involuntarily tug the long chain, exerting pressure on the pulley system weights. Those weights would go down and stretch my breasts, she would later testify, and then he connected them to my vagina. It hurt so bad. Eventually, the pain proved too much, and Cynthia Vigil lost consciousness as her body shut down. The following morning, she awoke to find herself back in the den, handcuffed and shackled to the wall. It was a sunny Monday morning, and David Ray was getting ready for work. At about 7 a.m., he came into the den dressed in his park ranger uniform and began unlocking Vigil's handcuffs and shackles, leaving a chain to the wall by the dog collar. Then, saying he'd be back later to introduce her to the toy box, he drove off to breakfast at the Shamrock Diner. Soon after he left, Hendy came into the den, dropping the keys to the padlocked metal collar on the coffee table, lying just a few feet away from the bed. Seeing the keys, Cynthia determined to try to escape at the earliest opportunity. Hendy seemed almost oblivious to Vigil's presence as she turned on the television and watched her soaps. But when Vigil asked her why they were doing this to her, Hendy became angry. She called me a bitch, a spick, and a lot of other stuff, Vigil said. Cindy told me they would drug me so I would forget what happened, and then I would be given back my clothes and just put on the highway. When Vigil asked how long they would keep her prisoner, Hendy said, "A couple of months." Then she told Cynthia how compared to David Ray, she was relatively new to kidnapping, raping, and murdering girls. She also mentioned how they had abducted Angelica Montano a few weeks earlier. Hendy then explained that when they tired of Vigil's body, the couple were going to abduct a 10-year-old girl and train her to be their sex slave. At about 3 p.m., Hendy went into the main living room to watch more television. Seizing her opportunity, Vigil forced herself as far across the bed as the chain would allow, wrapped her feet around the base of the coffee table, and slowly pulled it toward her. When it was near enough, she reached over and grabbed the keys, pushing the table back in its proper place. She then managed to open the padlock, freeing the chain from the wall, and tiptoeing across the den to the telephone to dial 911. Her heart was pounding as she waited for the emergency call to go through. Just as the operator finally answered, Hendy walked in and caught Vigil. Hendy picked up a green glass lamp and smashed it over Cynthia's head. "You're not going anywhere," Hendy screamed as she hung up the phone. With blood pouring from a deep head wound, Vigil grabbed an ice pick from the table and started hitting Hendy over the head, knocking her senseless. Then I took off out the front door and ran and ran and ran. It had been a slow Monday afternoon for Francis Baird, who covers the crime beat for the Sierra County Sentinel, which boasts the second-largest circulation of TRC's 3 weekly newspapers. Although just 17, the bookish-looking, bespectacled blonde with the wide smile was literally born into journalism, as her mother Myrna owns the paper, as well as the town's only radio station, KCHS AM. Just 2 weeks earlier, Frances had covered the biggest story of her career so far. When Sierra County Sheriff's Deputy Kelly Clark had been murdered by a prisoner she was single-handedly transporting to Grant's correctional facility. The young mother became the first officer in Sierra County history to be killed in the line of duty. "Our town was traumatized by Kelly Clark's death," said Myrna Baird, who helped set up a trust fund for Clark's teenage daughter. "It was devastating." At 3:24 p.m. that afternoon, Frances was sitting at her desk writing a story when she heard the 911 hang-up call on the office police scanner. First, the dispatcher said there was a lady who was upset and distraught, Baird would later remember. When they called back, there was another lady saying everything was fine. Then about 2 minutes later, they had a 911 call reporting a naked woman running down the road. When a police message came over the scanner a little while later announcing 2 arrests, Frances jumped to her car and headed straight to Elephant Butte. By the time Cindy Hendy regained consciousness, her prisoner had escaped. In desperation, she telephoned David Parker Ray at work, telling him what had happened. He told her he would be over immediately and instructed her to stay calm until he could get home. Then, as Hendy, bleeding profusely from a deep head wound, tried to regain her composure, the telephone started ringing. She answered it to find the central dispatcher on the line, making the required follow-up call to a 911 hang-up. Trying to sound as normal as possible, Hendy assured her that everything was fine. When the dispatcher kept asking if anything was wrong, Hendy said that there must have been some mistake and put down the phone. A few minutes later, David Ray came through the front door and told her to get in the RV so they could search for V Hill. But they only got a couple of blocks from the trailer when they ran into a police roadblock and surrendered. As they were taken to the park ranger station in Elephant Butte State Park to be questioned by detectives, David Ray smiled blissfully, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Chapter 17. The Evil in Elephant Butte. Throughout the short drive to Sierra Vista Hospital in TRC, Cynthia V. Hill kept sobbing, "Don't let them get me. Don't let them get me." State-registered nurse Lynn Cummings was on duty in the emergency room when Deputy Lucas Alvarez brought in V. Hill, wearing a pink robe and the metal collar with 6 inches of heavy chain still dangling from it. "She was frantic," said Nurse Cummings. "We gave her emotional support and told her she was safe." V. Hill's head was covered in blood, and she had numerous cuts and bruises over her body, lacerations on her back, abrasions on her wrists, and small puncture wounds on her breasts. After using metal cutters to remove the collar, doctors treated her wounds and did a standard rape test. Then V. Hill was allowed to take a shower and eat her first meal since being abducted Saturday morning. Later that night, V. Hill was interviewed at the hospital by New Mexico State Police Special Agent Wesley LaQuesta, who would take control of the initial stages of the investigation. Although the 34-year-old agent had 8 years of service with the state police, he had only been transferred to the Criminal Investigation Center 3 months earlier and considered himself a rookie. Still sobbing, Cynthia told LaQuesta about her abduction in Albuquerque and her ensuing 3-day nightmare. The young agent took careful notes as V. Hill described being raped by Ray with various devices, as Hendy looked on, brandishing a small revolver. Back at Bass Road, Deputy Sheriff Pete Bewidowich of the Sierra County Police Department had been one of the first officers on the scene and had secured the double wide to protect all the evidence. But when Sierra County Sheriff Terry Byers arrived and saw some of the bizarre sexual items involved, he immediately called in the New Mexico State Police. "We are a relatively small department, and we don't have a lot of resources," he later explained. "Once we looked at the house, we determined that it was just a little bit out of our league." That night, Sheriff Byers called Sergeant Keith Clayton Rogers, a New Mexico State Police criminal investigations supervisor based in Roswell, New Mexico, and asked him to take over the investigation. Meanwhile, Agent LaQuesta worked late into the night, preparing the necessary search warrants for Ray's Bass Road compound, which were duly signed by District Court Judge Thomas Pestak. That first night we were charging, he said, we worked hard doing the initial search warrants and stuff like that. On Tuesday morning, as Ray and Hendy were taken to the Sierra County Detention Center on North Date Street, TRC, and booked on charges of kidnapping, assault, conspiracy, and criminal sexual penetration, Sergeant K.C. Rogers began setting up a command post where the investigation would be based. An 18-year veteran of the New Mexico State Police, Sergeant Rogers had been with the Criminal Investigation Center for a year and a half and was one of their best agents. A converted boat hangar became the main command post for the investigation. Standing over the Parks and Recreation Training Center in Elephant Butte State Park, it would accommodate more than 100 investigators from the state police and the FBI. Ironically, David Ray was well acquainted with the center from his maintenance job with the Parks Department. I was in charge of the command post, explained Sergeant Rogers. I did everything from sweep floors and clean bathrooms to having briefings with the agents. From the first day of the investigation, Sergeant Rogers laid down a strict routine, which would be adhered to by all the specialist task forces assigned to the case. There were to be daily briefings in the morning and evening, where agents would report on their progress and receive assignments. The hangar would also act as a clearinghouse for the hundreds of pieces of evidence to be processed. Sergeant Rogers also appointed New Mexico Police Special Agent John Briscoe to head up the evidence response teams that would be pouring over the Bass Road crime scene, gathering forensic evidence. FBI Special Agent Trent Peterson was drafted in the first day to assist Briscoe in setting up the crime scene, with a brief to pay special attention to the toy box. When we arrived at the scene, we taped off the area and photographed it, Agent Peterson later testified. On the north side of Mr. Ray's property was a white camp trailer, and that was the specific area I was assigned. At about 10 a.m., TRC locksmith Bill King was summoned to Elephant Butte to open the white cargo trailer, known to neighbors as David's workshop. By the time he arrived, the top part of Bass Road had already been cordoned off, and Ray's yard was swarming with state police. King was then met by Agent Briscoe, who accompanied him to the trailer. "You got that eerie feeling as you approached," said King. "They still thought it was a horse shed." King easily picked the commercial lock, standing back as Agent Briscoe entered the dark, windowless trailer. "Holy shit," exclaimed Briscoe in astonishment, as his eyes slowly adjusted to the light, and he saw for the first time the strange contents of the toy box. The two men stared in amazement at what appeared to be a doctor's office, with a fully functional gynecological chair. There were neatly arranged glass cabinets of sexual devices lining the walls, and what appeared to be a full-sized coffin lying along one end. "I could feel an evil presence in there," King would later remember. "It was like something floating in the air, and I didn't want to be there. I'd seen enough." Even the experienced New Mexico State Police investigator was unprepared for the horrors of the toy box, where he would spend the next 4 days assembling evidence. That afternoon, he was joined by Special Agents Lou Mallion, Frank Jacoby, and Jimmy Tapoya, who began carefully videotaping and photographing every last inch of Ray's torture trailer. There was a sign that said, "Bondage Room, Satan's Den," Agent Briscoe later told prosecutors. In the top left corner, there was like a reminder saying, "Remember, a woman will do or say anything to get loose. They will kick, bite, scream, threaten, scratch, yell, run, lie, beg, offer sex." There were also rows of stainless steel medical cabinets containing David Ray's own drawings, which depicted women being tortured in different ways, with different-sized dildos, and an elaborate diorama of tiny nude models carefully posed in bondage scenarios. The agents also discovered more than 100 videotapes and hundreds of still photographs, showing numerous women being tortured. By the door lay a video camera and a player with a blank tape in it. The player was wired to a TV monitor set up directly in front of a gynecological chair, so the victims could watch themselves being tortured. Another medical cabinet was well stocked with an assortment of surgical drugs, including chloroform, ammonia pills, and alcohol. There were also condoms and a hypodermic syringe. There were numerous medical supplies, said Agent Briscoe. Everything you can pretty well think of. On a bookshelf on the other side of the trailer was Ray's personal library, including American Psycho, Human Sexuality, Sexual Behavior of the Human Female, and the Family Medical Guide. Top to bottom, the toy box was packed with examples of Ray's demonic ingenuity. From the ceiling hung an elaborate pulley system, incorporating clamps, ropes, padlocks, and tie-downs, similar to the one that Cynthia V. Hill had been held in. Even more macabre was Ray's specially adapted coffin, complete with ventilation holes and an electric fan. Inside, he had inserted D-rings at both ends, so a victim could be restrained before the top was closed. Special Agent Briscoe felt his flesh crawl as he read Ray's instructions posted on a notice board above the coffin. "Don't let her get to you," it stated. "If she was worth taking, she's worth keeping. Never trust a chained captive." Perhaps even more ominous, hanging on a wall nearby, was a detailed map of Elephant Butte Lake, with about a dozen X's marking various locations. Still in denial, Cindy Hendy was hanging tough. The morning after they were arrested, she and David Ray were transported to the 39-bed Sierra County Detention Center in T.O.C. to be interviewed separately by Agent Wesley LaQuesta. It had been a long night in the state park's training center, and Ray and Hendy had spent the last 16 hours in separate rooms under guard, drinking coffee and chain-smoking. "I was shot, tired, and so was Cindy Hendy," Agent LaQuesta would later remember. But she was clear-headed and very manipulating, trying to control the interview. "I felt she was a tad psychopathic, and she didn't have a conscience, and would almost blame the victim, calling her a prostitute." According to Hendy, everything that happened with Cynthia V. Hill was consensual. She claimed they had arranged to bring Cynthia back to Elephant Butte to help her kick her heroin addiction, in exchange for her participating in some bondage and discipline sessions. Agent LaQuesta didn't buy her outrageous story for a second, and before long she began contradicting herself, stubbornly proclaiming her innocence. Then LaQuesta went next door to interview David Parker Ray, who appeared far more reasonable and straightforward. Remaining calm throughout the interview, Ray readily admitted torturing and whipping V. Hill, but he, too, claimed it was consensual and part of his cold turkey program to help her beat heroin. Trying to be as helpful as possible, he even made a pencil drawing of a butt plug, telling the astonished agent how he had inserted it into V. Hill. Finally, Ray told LaQuesta, "Well, I am talking too much," bringing the interview to a close. "Probably should get a lawyer, because I think I'm in a lot of trouble." That night, the story broke on all 3 Albuquerque television stations, sending shockwaves throughout Elephant Butte and T.O.C. All 3 network affiliates led with a sensational account of an unnamed young woman running naked through the streets of Elephant Butte, with a metal collar after being kidnapped as a sex slave. Even more incredible, an engaged couple had been arrested in connection with the bizarre crime. Merritt Storm watched the news in stunned disbelief. As he heard the account of kidnap, rape, and torture, he realized the similarities between what Angelica Montano had said and what Ray and Hendy were being accused of in connection with Cynthia V. Hill. "I really felt like a shithead for not believing her," he later admitted. "She was telling the truth." Storm immediately telephoned his friend Jean Branner, who had also seen the story. She too realized that Hendy must have been telling the truth during her drunken ramblings 10 days earlier. "When we saw the arrests on television, my husband and I looked at each other and were dumbstruck," remembered Branner. Shit. Everything she had said about the torture chamber and serial murders was true. It was all starting to fall into place. The Branners then drove straight over to Storm's house to compare notes and track down Angelica Montano in Albuquerque. "We said, 'You'd better get your butt down to T.O.C., remembered Branner. "The FBI will need to see you." But it would be another 3 days before Montano would be sober enough to return and be interviewed by detectives. The following morning, Merritt Storm was walking through Ralph Edwards Park in TOC when he happened to run into Roy Yancey, who was walking his dog Coco. Storm asked if he had heard the news, and when Yancey blankly replied that he had not, Storm told him how David Ray and Cindy Hendy had been arrested for kidnap and rape. There was no reaction at all, remembered Storm some months later. He was just so nonchalant and calm about the whole thing. If I had been involved, I would have been out of here. I'd have been on my horse and disappeared. Chapter 18. The Confession. On Wednesday morning, David Parker Ray and Cindy Hendy were arraigned at Sierra County Magistrates Court. As the couple, handcuffed and wearing standard orange prison attire, were separately escorted by armed police past a line of reporters and TV crews, Hendy was asked if she was guilty. "I'm afraid to talk, as I don't want to get hurt," she replied cryptically. When a reporter followed up, asking who was going to hurt her, Hendy answered, "I can't say, but I am innocent." A few minutes later, 59-year-old Ray was led through the media gauntlet and into court by Sheriff Byers and Captain Earl Easterling. "It didn't happen that way," hissed the tall, grizzled park ranger through his bushy walrus moustache when reporters confronted him. Inside the courtroom, Ray was formally charged with kidnapping, 3 counts of criminal sexual penetration, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, 2 charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and criminal sexual penetration. Hendy was charged with kidnapping, accessory to the crime of criminal sexual penetration, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, criminal sexual penetration, and conspiracy to kidnap. They each now faced up to 93 years behind bars and $85,000 in fines. Judge Thomas Pestak set bail for both defendants at a record $1 million. Agent Wesley LaQuesta, in court for the arraignment, noticed a distinct change in Hendy's demeanor as the charges were formally read, and she realized that she faced the rest of her life behind bars. "I think then it started hitting home for Miss Hendy," remembered LaQuesta. When Judge Pestak put a $1 million bond on her, she got teary-eyed. After the arraignment, Hendy asked to speak to LaQuesta, saying she had new information. He then ensured that he had taped evidence to prove that she had approached him without any coercion. He did not want any legal comebacks later. "I made sure she realized that she was waiving her rights," he said. "Then I took her into a little conference room in the court." There, Cindy Hendy made a stunning confession, which, if proved true, would make David Parker Ray one of the most prolific serial killers in American criminal history. "She started saying she was real fearful to give me the information," said LaQuesta, "because there were people that would come after her." Hendy told LaQuesta that her fiancé had murdered at least 14 people, including 2 women whose photographs had already been discovered in the toy box. LaQuesta listened in rapt astonishment, as Hendy chillingly described how Ray would use makeup to make his victims more photogenic, or if he thought certain parts of their bodies wouldn't photograph well without it. Hendy has related to officers involved in this investigation that the defendant, Ray, has been responsible for 14 homicides, LaQuesta wrote in his March 26th search warrant, which was immediately sealed from the media. Officers were advised by co-defendant Hendy that Ray would photograph the victims in various states of bondage and torture. Photographs of Cynthia V. Hill were taken as she was being tortured. Some of these photographs have been found by officers involved in this case. Then, Hendy described how Ray would bury or dump his victims all over the southwestern United States. She said he had some dumping grounds in 3 states, said LaQuesta. He had 2 local dumping grounds in New Mexico, one north of TOC in a ravine area, and another between Caballo Lake and TOC. The rookie agent was so stunned by Hendy's story that he had to control his excitement as he realized the full implications of what she was saying. "My adrenaline just went wow," he said, when she started talking about the possibility of other victims that had been murdered and buried out in the desert. As soon as Hendy finished her taped confession, she was returned to jail, and LaQuesta immediately briefed his superior, Sergeant K.C. Rogers, who called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation's legendary behavioral science unit based in Quantico, Virginia. For if what Hendy said was true, David Parker Ray would join the ranks of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. The FBI's National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, NCAVC, now went into action, taking Hendy's confession very seriously indeed. Within 24 hours, agents had dispatched 3 of their leading officers to Elephant Butte to prepare David Ray's criminal profile. They offered these preliminary guidelines to Ray's likely deviant behavior as a serial sexual sadist. Based upon information relating to the photos, journals, and statements to officers by Hendy, the Behavioral Sciences Unit has advised that persons who act as Ray has been described as acting will often keep mementos or trophies from their victims. Persons such as Ray will then bury these items near trees or plants, and in watering the trees or plants will be caring for the memento or trophy buried near it. The FBI profilers also advise that serial killers often replanted existing trees or bushes to mark where they have buried their victim trophies. These can range from hair and body parts to jewelry and items of clothing. Neighbors in the area have reported seeing Ray on numerous occasions digging up and or replanting trees on the premises, LaQuesta carefully noted in his search warrant. The New Mexico State Police and the FBI agreed that Hendy's confession should remain a closely guarded secret until murder charges could be brought. A few days later, at a second interview with LaQuesta, Rogers, and FBI agent Larry Huff, Hendy repeated her accusations, supplying an even more detailed picture of her fiancé's alleged murderous past. She went into a real long tangent of history about David Ray and provided lots of good information, said LaQuesta. She said Ray had been doing these things since he was a young teenager, and his first experience was a lady that he tied to a tree and then killed. As Hendy revealed more and more graphic details about Ray, she warmed to her subject, making LaQuesta think that she was actually enjoying it. Maybe she was just BSing to get herself out of jail, he said, but later her information was corroborated and was accurate. And the investigators were particularly interested when she casually mentioned an old boyfriend of hers named Roy, saying he'd killed a woman named Marie Parker several years earlier. She called him Roy Boy, said LaQuesta, and she talked about him quite a lot. Later, we confirmed through other interviews his name was Dennis Roy Yancey. As scores of FBI agents converged on Elephant Butte from all over the country, John Branner went on television to reveal Cindy Hendy's drunken confession a few weeks earlier. In an interview for Albuquerque's NBC affiliate KOB-TV, Branner described how Hendy had said that David Ray dumped 4 to 6 in the lake after he split the bodies down the middle, filling them with stones for ballast before wrapping them in chicken wire so they would not have buoyancy when he put them in the lake. Cindy said she had read serial killer magazines and books her whole life, explained Branner, and now she was living with one. On Friday, March 26th, FBI Special Agent Anthony Maxwell arrived at 513 Bass Road and was shown around David Ray's compound by the New Mexico State Police. Agent Maxwell set up a second command post directly in front of Ray's property. Working with the state police agent John Briscoe, he would then direct 3 FBI evidence response teams in the search for bodies. During a distinguished 18-year career with the FBI, Agent Maxwell had processed hundreds of crime scenes, investigating homicides, kidnappings, and bombings. But the David Parker Ray investigation would stand out from all of them. The FBI has created what we call evidence response teams, explained Maxwell. These are teams that have been trained and equipped to collect evidence at crime scenes. Each evidence response team, ERT, is comprised of 8 agents. The FBI considered the Ray investigation so complex that 30 agents had already been drafted into Elephant Butte, joining the battery of New Mexico State Police officers already there. The FBI, the State Police, and the State Parks Department had agreed to pool their resources for the investigation. I was the overall team leader, said Maxwell. I was responsible for processing the scene. Each of the 3 ERTs had its own team leader, who would report directly to Maxwell. It would be each leader's responsibility to take control of one of the designated crime scenes, identify the amount of work needed, and organize the necessary experts, supplies, and equipment. It would be vital to create a chain of command to store and catalog evidence before it was transferred to the FBI storage facility in Albuquerque. Explained Agent Maxwell, "The first thing that a team leader does is walk through a property and determine what kind of search patterns we are going to use. In this case, we decided we would assign a team to every large area that we wanted covered." Maxwell split the crime scene into 8 major areas. The living quarters, a raised double-wide trailer, the garage area, the pickup truck, the RV, the sailboat, the toy box, a white storage shed, and a red storage shed. At 8 a.m. Friday, March 26th, Maxwell held his first daily briefing at the new Bass Road Command Post to assign the ER team's daily activities. It had already been decided that the FBI would run the investigation, while the New Mexico State Police would handle all crime scene security. That morning, Maxwell took the precaution of extending the crime scene farther out into Bass Road with bright yellow tape to prevent the growing army of reporters and curiosity seekers from getting too close. Scattered around the compound were picnic tables hidden by blue tarpaulins, where investigators laid out and organized evidence brought out from Ray's trailer and the toy box. These included video equipment, computers, surgical tools, and chemicals. Numerous evidence markers, red flags on foot-high wooden stakes, littered the compound, as dozens of FBI agents milled around, collecting evidence. Everyone entering or leaving the crime scene had to go through a checkpoint and sign in and out. They would then be issued a white paper tie-back suit and special gloves, so as not to contaminate forensic evidence. The FBI also dispatched crack 2-man teams of investigators to fan out across New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, and follow up leads to all locations where David Ray had ever lived and worked. Among the first to inspect the crime scene was 7th Judicial District Attorney Ron Lopez, whose office would be prosecuting the case. With him was the Director of the State Department for Public Safety, Darren White. They're trying to put the pieces together of what appears to be a very sick and disturbing puzzle, White told reporters on his way out. That takes time. D.A. Lopez said that as yet there was no indication of any homicides, but he was certain that other women had been kidnapped and tortured. "We'll be here for quite a while," said the bearded, pudgy, moon-faced DA. "In my experience, there must be other victims." On Saturday morning, Angelica Montano stepped off the Albuquerque bus in T.O.C. and headed straight to Merritt Storm's house. Storm, who had wired her bus fare the day before, was there waiting with John and Jean Branner. The first thing they did was play Angelica all the television news footage that Storm had taped since the story first broke. Watching it for the first time, Montano became very emotional, demanding that Storm give her the tape before she went to the police. Then the 4 of them went out on Broadway and tried to flag down a police car. "They didn't take any notice," said Jean Branner, "so I got in my car and drove her out to the lake." The 2 women arrived at the Bass Road checkpoint at 2:45 p.m. Reporters and TV crews were watching as Branner and Montano spoke to the duty officer and were escorted inside the crime scene. Jean Branner put a comforting arm around the sobbing Montano, as 4 state police officers placed a black jacket over her head to shield her identity from the media. The women were then taken to the command post trailer, where Montano told agents how Ray and Hendy had kidnapped, raped, and tortured her less than a month earlier. "She told them everything," said Branner. "They seemed very interested." The following morning, investigators discovered bones lying on the ground in Ray's backyard. As FBI agents began placing little red flags to mark the areas where bones had been found, the media speculated that they were human. Adding fuel to the growing media frenzy was newly installed FBI spokesman Doug Belden, who told NBC Network News that it was a possibility the Ray compound would soon be dug up. Public Safety Officer Darren White was more forthright, delivering an impromptu press conference by the Bass Road Command Post. "When we witnessed firsthand the evidence